Section 1. The question that started everything. Who actually ended the world? There is a moment, hovering somewhere in the very early hours of the 23rd of October 2077, when the world as everyone had ever known it simply stopped. No warning siren reached everyone in time. No final broadcast made it through every household. No last conversation was finished. In cities across America and China and beyond, people were doing ordinary things, eating breakfast, arguing with a coworker, watching the morning news programs, trying to find parking, writing half-finished emails that would never be sent. And then the sky turned white, and the sound came, and everything that had existed for the whole long history of human civilization was rearranged in a matter of hours. In the Fallout universe, this is called the Great War. It lasted approximately 2 hours, which is a number that the games mention matter-of-factly in historical terminals and educational programs and propaganda broadcasts, and which grows more devastating the longer you sit with it. 2 hours for everything. 2 hours for the libraries and the hospitals and the diners and the highways and the families in their houses watching the sky go wrong. 2 hours. And then 200 years of what came after. For almost 3 decades since the original Fallout game came out in 1997, nobody could say with certainty who actually pressed the button first. The silence at the center of that question is not an oversight. It is one of the most deliberate choices in the franchise's history. A piece of negative space carved out by the people who designed the world because they understood something important. In any conflict large enough to end everything, assigning simple blame is the wrong kind of answer. Every faction in the Fallout universe has a version of the First Strike story that makes their side look like the wronged party. American propaganda terminals claim unprovoked aggression. Enclave broadcasts describe China attacking a defensive nation. Chinese military holotapes found throughout the games describe an empire acting out of desperation against a superpower conducting biological warfare on a covert scale. Every account is true in some narrow sense. None of them is the whole picture. Then, in the autumn of 2023, Tim Kaine, the man who co-created the first Fallout game in the mid-90s at Interplay Entertainment, sat down for a long conversation with a YouTuber known as TK's Mantis, and something changed. They talked for about 90 minutes, covering the history of the franchise from its inception, the design decisions that shaped its world, the things Kaine would have done differently if he had held control of the property longer, the ideas that made it into the games, and the ones that did not. And then, somewhere near the end of that conversation, almost as an aside, Kaine let something slip that the Fallout community had been hunting for since the very first game went out to retail. He said that the reason America got nuked was that the United States had been conducting illegal biological weapons research. The project was called the Forced Evolutionary Virus, which most players know simply as FEV. It had been developed in a classified facility in California, at a place called the Mariposa Military Base, and it had been tested on civilian workers who had been assigned to the base under the pretense of a different labor program. China, which had its own intelligence operations running inside the American scientific establishment, found out. The Chinese government issued formal demands that America cease the program immediately. America said it would. America quietly moved the labs instead, continuing the research under different cover and different classification levels. China, facing a resource crisis that had been grinding its population for years and losing a conventional ground war in Alaska against an American military that was better equipped and better supplied, watched this deception unfold through its intelligence channels. The FEV, when it worked as intended, could rewrite human DNA at a fundamental level. A nation with a weaponized virus capable of transforming entire populations was a threat that made conventional military comparisons meaningless. So China made a decision that, from the perspective of its leadership in that moment, may have seemed like the only card left to play. They launched first. America launched back. And then every other nation with nuclear capabilities watched missiles crisscrossing the sky on radar screens, moving in patterns that made it impossible to determine with confidence who was targeting whom and who might be next, and they joined in. The whole thing unraveled in less than 2 hours. When Kaine said this in the interview, TK's Mantis stopped him. He told Kaine that what he had just said was earth-shattering, that fans had been debating this exact question for over 20 years. Kaine looked genuinely puzzled by the reaction. In his mind, it had always been clear from the game's existing text. He had understood it as settled within the original design team, simply never committed to paper in a way that players could point to definitively. That is the thing about the Fallout franchise's relationship with its own mystery. The gaps are often not oversights. They are negative space, deliberately maintained, because the people who built the world understood that ambiguity sustains engagement in a way that answers cannot. Every time you enter a new terminal in a new location and find a fragment of the pre-war world's political history, you are adding to a mosaic that the game never fully assembles for you. That is its own kind of art. The question of who fired first will still be interesting, will still generate new angles and new interpretations, decades after the games first raised it, because the franchise never gave a final canonical answer in the games themselves. Kane's revelation does not let anyone off the hook. The United States was conducting research on a virus that, when it worked as intended, rewrote human DNA and could transform ordinary people into something almost unrecognizable. The super mutants you fight across every Fallout game, from the Master's army in the original, to the hulking inhabitants of the Capital Wasteland in Fallout 3, to the nightmarish Nightkin who served the Master and developed schizophrenia from prolonged stealth boy use, are all the product of FEV exposure gone catastrophically wrong. These are people, or were people, whose bodies and minds were rewritten by a military program that the American government was actively lying about to the international community. China did not strike an innocent nation. China struck a nation committing one of the most profound ethical violations imaginable, and then brazenly lying about it when confronted. So the moral geometry of the Great War, even with Kane's clarification, does not resolve into clean lines. China launched first, technically. The conditions that made China feel that launching was necessary were created by American decisions made in secret without any democratic accountability and in violation of international law. Both things are simultaneously true, and the franchise has always understood that this is the only honest way to talk about catastrophic military conflict. The one that fires first is rarely the one that started it. And then, in 2024, the Prime Video Fallout television series arrived and introduced another layer to the question entirely, one that Todd Howard confirmed as canonical to the franchise in interviews surrounding the show's release. Through the story of Cooper Howard, an actor who was also a Vault-Tec spokesperson before the Great War, whose experience forms one of the show's primary narrative threads, the audience is shown something that no game had ever fully committed to showing. A pre-war corporate board meeting in which the end of the world was discussed as a business strategy. The show reveals that Vault-Tec, in collusion with representatives from other massive pre-war corporations, was aware that the Vault system required a nuclear war to achieve its purpose. The vaults existed to shelter people, yes, but they also existed to generate data from controlled human experiments conducted on captive populations who had nowhere else to go. Without a war, there were no Vault subjects. Without Vault subjects, the entire infrastructure Vault-Tec had spent decades and incalculable amounts of money constructing was merely expensive bomb shelters. The show implies, and by its finale essentially confirms, that someone in that room, representing Vault-Tec's interests, made the decision that the war needed to happen on a specific timeline and arranged for it to happen. Whether this means Vault-Tec physically launched missiles or simply arranged for the existing tensions between America and China to boil over at a moment of Vault-Tec's choosing, whether they were the trigger or the conditions, is something the show deliberately leaves blurred. The implication is stark enough without the specifics. The apocalypse was not an accident. It was not even, at the most fundamental level, a political miscalculation between two superpowers who had run out of ways to de-escalate. It was arranged by a corporation in the private sector that had calculated its own financial interest in the destruction of civilization and acted accordingly. This recontextualizes everything in the franchise. Every vault you walk into across 6 games, every skeleton slumped over a workstation in a bomb shelter, every ghoul who has been alive for 2 centuries, trying to make sense of what happened to the world they lived in. All of it becomes the downstream consequence of a boardroom decision made by people who would never personally experience the thing they caused, the most nihilistic possible explanation for the end of civilization, and Bethesda has stamped it canonical through the show's status as official franchise media. Tim Kaine, when he revisited the Great War question in late 2025, said something worth sitting with. He acknowledged that Bethesda now controls what is and is not canon, and that his perspective on the franchise's founding mythology is the perspective of someone who is no longer making decisions about the property. But he also observed that his version of the Great War's cause and the television show's version are not necessarily contradictory. China may have launched the first missiles. Vault-Tec may have maneuvered the geopolitical situation into a state where someone launching was inevitable. A corporation ensuring the conditions for a war it had already planned around is not the same as a corporation pressing a button. Both things can exist in the same universe, on the same morning, in the same 2 hours. What this creates, when you hold all the threads together, is a great war with 3 distinct and interlocking layers of culpability. The immediate cause: China's first strike. The proximate cause: America's biological weapons program and the deception that made China feel it had no option but to act. The systemic cause: a corporate infrastructure that needed the war to happen and spent years arranging the world so that it would. Peel back any one of these layers and there is another underneath. None of them are the full story. All of them are part of it. Leonard Boyarsky, Tim Kane's co-creator on the original games, has said publicly over the years that who started the Great War is ultimately the wrong question. Not because the answer is trivial, but because the point of the Great War in the Fallout universe was never to assign blame to any single actor. The point was to construct a world in which the recognizable logic of ordinary human decisions, the institutional pressures, the competitive nationalism, the corporate self-interest, the willingness of powerful people to externalize the costs of their choices onto people who have no say leads through a series of individually comprehensible steps to a result so catastrophically out of proportion to any individual decision that no one person can fairly claim to have caused it. The Great War is not a story about one bad actor. It is a story about systems, about the way that institutions protect themselves from accountability by distributing decision-making until no individual feels responsible for the outcome, about the way that nationalism provides permission for actions that simple ethics would forbid, about the way that profit motive operates in spaces where the consequences of profit-seeking fall on people who are not at the table when the decisions are made. In 2023, Tim Kane said something in a separate interview that captures the franchise's philosophy more cleanly than any vault entry or piece of propaganda ever has. He said that the design team always understood the Great War not as something that was done to America by China or to China by America, but as something that the logic of the world they had built made inevitable. The war was not an aberration. It was the destination of a particular direction of travel, arrived at the moment when all the available alternatives had been foreclosed. The question who started it implies a beginning that was a choice. The franchise's deeper argument is that the beginning was a long time before anyone made a choice, and that by the time choices were being made, the outcome was already determined. That is the mystery underneath the mystery. Not who fired first, but what kind of world produces the conditions in which firing first becomes thinkable. And that question, unlike the first strike question, has an answer. It is the world that Fallout shows you, in the ruins of every pre-war building you walk through, in every piece of corporate propaganda you find on every terminal screen, in every exploitation, and every lie, and every decision by every organization that valued its own perpetuation over the people it claimed to serve. The Great War happened because that is where the world was going. The bombs were just how it arrived. After the opening section, drop a comment with your location and what time it is where you are. And if you want more content like this, go ahead and subscribe. Section 2, Vault-Tec's Hidden Architecture, the social experiments behind the shelter. On the surface, Vault-Tec was a construction company with a government contract. They built large underground shelters designed to house American citizens in the event of a nuclear exchange and to provide a stable foundation for rebuilding civilization in its aftermath. That was the pitch, dressed up in the cheerful aesthetics of the era. Smiling families descending gleaming stairwells in matching jumpsuits, the Pip-Boy mascot beaming from every advertisement, the reassuring assurance that America's most precious resource, its people, would be kept safe no matter what happened up above. But Vault-Tec also had a secondary program, a quieter one, running beneath the reassuring surface of the public-facing shelter pitch. And across 6 mainline games and the television series, the ruins of that program are scattered across the wasteland, in the form of hollowed-out vault complexes full of bones and corrupted terminal entries, and the kind of clinical documentation that makes you realize the horror was not incidental. The horror was the design. The full scope of what Vault-Tec was doing can be reconstructed imperfectly, because the records are damaged and scattered and sometimes deliberately obscured from the hundreds of terminal entries, holotapes, and human remains the games distribute across their maps. And when you assemble that picture, you find not an organization that built survival shelters and ran some supplementary experiments on the side. You find an organization that was primarily running experiments, with the survival program as cover and legal protection, and a mechanism for recruiting a captive population that had no recourse and no exit. One of the most revealing documents in the entire franchise is not housed in any single vault. It is a piece of lore background established in Fallout 2 and elaborated across subsequent games. That Vault Tech maintained a small number of what it called control vaults, which were designed to function exactly as advertised genuine shelters without experimental variables introduced into the population. These control vaults were necessary because, without them, the experiment data from the other vaults was scientifically meaningless. You need a baseline to measure against. The fact that control vaults were even needed implies, by definition, that all the others were something other than genuine shelters. The control vault most frequently discussed in the games is Vault 8, which is mentioned in Fallout 2 as having functioned correctly. Its population was issued a GECK, a Garden of Eden creation kit, a terraforming device designed to help vault populations rebuild on the surface, and they used it, establishing a community called Vault City on the Northern California wasteland. Vault City, by the time the Chosen One encounters it in Fallout 2, is a functional and reasonably prosperous settlement with medical technology that far surpasses anything in the surrounding region. It is also deeply insular, politically conservative to the point of hostility, and divided between full citizens and servants who lack legal protections. The Control Vault produced a society that survived, but it also produced a society that reproduced the hierarchies and exclusions of the pre-war world in miniature, without the structural pressures that might have forced those hierarchies to evolve. But the Control Vaults are the exception. The rest form a catalog of deliberate cruelty that is difficult to read in sequence without the weight of it becoming considerable. Vault 11, situated in the Nevada desert near New Vegas, is one of the clearest illustrations of how far Vault Tech was willing to go in treating its residents as experimental subjects rather than human beings. The Vault's experiment was straightforward in its mechanism and devastating in its implications. When the residents entered, they were given one rule. Every year, they had to select one of their own number to be sacrificed. If they failed to produce a sacrifice, an automated system would kill the entire vault population. If they succeeded in making a sacrifice each year, they were promised eventual salvation through a process that was never clearly defined, and which was deliberately designed to be vague enough to motivate compliance without committing the organization to any specific outcome. The terminal records you find scattered through Vault 11's corridors in New Vegas reconstruct what happened over the decades that followed. The residents tried to build democratic systems around the sacrifice requirement, which predictably became political almost from the beginning. Who gets nominated depends on who is powerful enough to build a coalition against them, which means the sacrifice selection process becomes a machine for punishing social disfavor. The weakest, the most isolated, the least capable of building alliances, these are the people who end up on the ballot. People began voting for their rivals and their enemies, dressing political grievance in the language of communal necessity. The vocabulary of sacrifice became a vocabulary of elimination, and the boundary between them dissolved almost immediately. Then it got worse. People began to volunteer for sacrifice because they loved someone who was being nominated and could not bear to watch that nomination succeed. The Vault's overseers, who were responsible for managing the selection process, became the most powerful political figures in the community, which meant that the office of overseer became something people competed for intensely, and that competition produced its own corruption and manipulation. At various points in the Vault's history, different factions controlled the overseer position and used it to protect their allies and expose their opponents. By the time the automated systems ran out of people's willingness to comply, a small group of residents had organized a refusal. They decided decades into this process, after how many sacrifices the math of the terminal records does not quite resolve, that they were not going to do it anymore. They were not going to select another name. The automated system activated. The Vault's population was killed almost in its entirety. 5 people were in the reactor room at the time and survived the purge. These 5 discovered, afterward, that the Vault's experimental protocol had included a completion condition that the residents had never been told about. If the population ever refused to make a sacrifice, the automated system would spare the survivors and offer them an official commendation from Vault-Tec. The sacrifice requirement, in other words, was never infinite. It had an end condition. The Vault was designed to discover whether a population would maintain an ethical refusal even under total existential threat, and for however many decades it took, the population did not refuse, and people kept dying. The survivor's audio log, which you can find in the reactor room after navigating Vault 11's now silent corridors, is one of the most devastating pieces of writing in the franchise. 3 of the 5 took their own lives after hearing what the Vault had actually been studying. The remaining 2 decided to leave. Their fate after that is unknown. The Vault they left behind is a monument to what sustained institutional pressure can do to a community's ethical reasoning, how gradually, over years and decades, the abnormal becomes normalized, and the monstrous becomes ordinary, and the question of whether any of this is acceptable stops being asked because asking it is too dangerous. Vault-Tec was studying the conditions under which a democratic society would abandon its own principles. The Vault was a controlled test of moral erosion, with real people as the substrate. The commendation that was waiting for whoever finally refused was the cruelest detail. The organization that built the machine to study whether people could be broken by it had apparently anticipated that some population would eventually refuse, and had prepared a reward for that refusal. They were not just studying failure, they were timing how long it took. Vault 92 is a different register of horror. It was advertised as a sanctuary for musicians, a vault that would preserve the creative arts through the catastrophe, that would house artists and ensure that culture survived alongside people. The brochure language is exactly what you would expect: reassuring, warm, heavy, with the implicit promise that whatever happened above ground, beauty would endure beneath it. And the Vault did house musicians. 77 of them, selected through what appeared to be a legitimate audition and application process. What the musicians were not told was that their living quarters had been outfitted with a white noise system connected to the Vault's environmental control infrastructure. This system, when activated by the Vault's overseer on a schedule determined by the experiment's parameters, introduced a specific frequency of audio stimulus into the sleeping quarters at night. The stimulus was designed to trigger psychotic episodes in sleeping subjects not every time, but unpredictably, enough to study the cumulative effect of repeated exposure on a creative population who would be sensitive to audio environment in ways that a less carefully selected population might not be. The result, across the years of the experiment's operation, was a Vault that went from a community of artists to a community of people who were frightened of falling asleep, who developed elaborate rituals around bedtime in an attempt to protect themselves from something they could not identify or explain, who began to experience psychotic breaks that they attributed to stress or to each other rather than to what was actually happening. And then the breaks became more frequent, and the intervals between them shorter, and eventually people started being killed during episodes. The Vault collapsed from within, as its population was destroyed not by violence but by the slow, cumulative damage of a stimulus they never knew was being applied. The terminal records in Vault 92's Overseer's office are among the most disturbing in any of the Fallout games because they are clinical. The Overseer was not a monster in any obvious sense. The records do not suggest someone who enjoyed what was happening. They suggest someone who was following a protocol, monitoring variables, recording outcomes, adjusting parameters. The residents of Vault 92 were the experiment. Their suffering was data. The Overseer's job was to collect the data, and the records show them doing that job with the professional detachment of someone who has accepted, perhaps long ago, the premise under which the work was being conducted. Vault-Tec was studying whether a targeted audio stimulus could be weaponized to produce soldiers who would commit violence without rational restraint. The musicians were selected because their sensitivity to sound made them ideal test subjects. The cultural preservation framing was bait. By the time you walk through Vault 92 in Fallout 3, everyone inside it is dead, and the only records that remain are those clinical entries and the bones of 77 people who went underground believing they were being saved. Vault 87, beneath the capital wasteland, dispensed with even the pretense of a controlled study. Its residents were injected with FEV, the forced evolutionary virus, following the Vault's lockdown. The population was not told. There was no gradual introduction, no study of effects over time in the way that the other vaults were designed to produce longitudinal data. Vault 87 was a production facility. The goal was to produce super mutants in a controlled environment, at scale, for potential military use. The transformation process that followed lockdown was not designed to preserve anything of the people who went through it. Their intelligence, their memories, their identities, their relationships, all of it was treated as acceptable collateral in the production of a more physically capable form of soldier. The super mutants of the Capital Wasteland who appear throughout Fallout 3 are among the most aggressive and least intelligent in the franchise because the Vault 87 FEV strain stripped almost everything recognizable away. The Master's super mutants in the original game, and some of the New Vegas mutants, retain vocabulary, rudimentary social organization, occasionally something like personality. The Vault 87 mutants do not. They are what happens when you treat a population as raw material. You get a product that is powerful in a narrow sense and destroyed in every other sense. And then you have to decide what to do with the thing you made. Vault 112, in the central Capital Wasteland, takes a different shape of horror. Its residents were placed in suspended animation pods and connected to a virtual reality simulation system called Tranquility Lane, which was designed by its creator, a man named Stanislaus Braun, who served as the Vault's overseer to maintain the residents in a controlled virtual environment during their suspension. The simulation was a detailed recreation of a 1950s American suburb. The residents were aware that it was a simulation. What they were not told could not have anticipated was that Braun would choose to remain in Tranquility Lane himself, connected to the system as its administrator, with the ability to alter the simulation's parameters at will. Over the course of more than 2 centuries, Braun entertained himself by introducing variables into the simulation. He could summon monsters. He could stage disasters. He could kill residents and revive them. He could repopulate the simulation after a particularly destructive episode and start a new scenario. He could give any resident in the simulation the role of monster the ability to harm others within the dream and watch what they did with it. By the time the lone wanderer enters Tranquility Lane in Fallout 3, Braun has been doing this for over 200 years, and the people still plugged into the simulation have been living in an endlessly repeating nightmare, managed by someone who finds them entertaining. There is a way to end the simulation in Fallout 3 that kills everyone still in the pods, instantly a failsafe that Braun had apparently installed and then forgotten about, or chosen not to use. When activated, it gives the residents the only mercy the game can offer, a simultaneous ending to something that should have ended a long time ago. The other option is to keep playing Braun's game, which he asks the lone wanderer to do. The game does not make this choice feel good. It is not designed to. Vault 112 is a parable about what happens when one person has total control over the reality of everyone around them, and when that person's relationship to those people is defined entirely by amusement. It is, in its way, a more intimate horror than the mass production of Vault 87. It is one person, alone for 200 years, with 72 people who cannot fight back. Vault 29, which was established in the broader franchise lore through Tim Kane's Fallout Bible, a document detailing the backstory and design philosophy of the original games, and referenced more recently in Fallout 76, approached the experiment from a generational angle. Only children under the age of 15 were accepted into Vault 29. The children's parents were turned away at the door. The Vault was designed to study what kind of society children would build in the absence of adults, guided only by Zax, the Vault's artificial intelligence overseer, who was programmed with a specific ideology. The families who arrived at Vault 29's entrance, children in hand, probably terrified, probably not fully understanding what was happening, were separated at the threshold. The children went down. The parents did not. Whatever happened to those parents in the 2 hours that followed, the Vault's records do not address. The television show's contribution to the Vault mythology, the 3 interconnected vaults numbered 31, 32, and 33, reveals something about Vault-Tech's long-term ambitions that goes further than any individual experiment. These 3 vaults, located in the Los Angeles basin, were not designed as isolated population studies. They were designed as a system, a mechanism for producing loyal, capable Vault-Tech administrators who would emerge into the post-war wasteland as a prepared governing class, maintaining Vault-Tech's interests and organizational culture centuries after the corporation itself had ceased to exist as a legal entity. Vault 31 housed a population of cryogenically frozen Vault-Tec employees, people selected for corporate loyalty, managerial competence, and a specific kind of institutional thinking that Vault-Tec valued enough to preserve for future use. Every few decades, one of them was thawed out, given a briefing on current conditions in the interconnected vaults, and installed as an overseer in either Vault 32 or Vault 33, which housed ordinary residents who were not told about Vault 31's existence. The overseers from Vault 31 were trained to manage the breeding program, ensuring that the residents of 32 and 33 were intermarrying at intervals, producing children who would eventually be suitable candidates for overseer positions themselves, and preparing a generation of surface-ready administrators who would emerge convinced that their skills and values were their own rather than the product of 2 centuries of institutional design. The man running all of this from inside Vault 31, by the time the television show depicts its present-day events, had his brain removed and installed into a small robotic body, a robo-brain variant that one character in the show describes as a brain on a Roomba, so that he could continue overseeing the experiment across a biological lifespan that should have ended decades earlier. His name was Bud Askins, and he was a vice president at Vault-Tec before the war. He had reduced himself to a machine rather than relinquish control of a project he had invested everything in. He is, by any measure, a man who is still at work on a project whose goals no longer make sense in the world the project helped create. But the project continues because the system was designed to continue, and because Bud Askins has no conception of himself outside of it. The vaults, taken together, constitute one of the most sustained and coherent ethical arguments in popular culture about institutional power and the conditions under which people in positions of authority convince themselves that their subjects' suffering is acceptable. Vault-Tec is not full of monsters in the cartoonish sense. The people who designed these experiments were, for the most part, people who had convinced themselves of a purpose that the data would be valuable, that humanity's long-term survival required sacrifice, that the research being conducted was justified by its ultimate aims. The cruelty is not irrational. It is the product of rationalization, which is both more disturbing and more recognizable. Every skeleton in a vault corridor represents a life that ended in an environment designed to test its limits. The people who designed that environment were not there when the limits were reached. They were, at best, watching from behind the glass. Section 3. The Man in the Trench Coat. Unwrapping the mystery of the mysterious stranger. He arrives between heartbeats. There is no warning, no footstep, no gradual approach from the middle distance. You are in a fight, probably one you might not win, and the moment stretches out the way moments do when outcomes are uncertain, and then there are a few notes of music, something that sounds like a Western film theme translated into a single guitar motif, and a figure steps out of the darkness that should not have contained him. A beige trench coat, worn but not decrepit, a fedora at a specific angle, a .44 Magnum held with the casual competence of someone who has done this many times before. He fires, and then he is gone, and the space where he was standing is exactly as empty as it would be if he had never been there. The mysterious stranger has appeared in every mainline Fallout game since the original 1997 release. His presence is a perk mechanic, which means players have to choose to make him available. They have to decide, at some level of their character build, to invite him in, but within the fiction of the world, he is not a player-summoned ally. He is a person who shows up when you are in danger, fires one shot with devastating effect, and vanishes. The perk does not explain him. The games do not explain him. 25 years of official material has not fully explained him. He is there, and then he is not. And that is all anyone can say with certainty. In the first Fallout, he appears as a random encounter during combat for players with the perk. He wears a leather jacket rather than the trench coat he would later become associated with, which is a detail that lore researchers note as either evidence of early inconsistency or evidence that the character's visual presentation evolved over the decades of his in-universe existence. By Fallout 2, he has the trench coat and the hat. He also, in Fallout 2, appears as a woman in at least one encounter, a variant that is treated in-game as the same character, which either implies the stranger is not a fixed identity attached to a fixed body, or suggests something about Fallout 2's encounter design that does not have a clean in-universe explanation. The community has been arguing about this specific detail since the game came out in 1998. By the time the mysterious stranger returns in Fallout 3, he is fully codified. The trench coat, the hat, the 44 Magnum, the brief appearance, and the immediate disappearance. He is tied to the VATS system, the Vault Tech Assisted Targeting System, the franchise's signature slow-motion combat mechanic, which means he shows up in the frame rate drop and the stylized targeting of that interface, which gives his appearances a slightly unreal quality. He is already slightly outside the normal flow of events when he arrives. The special targeting system makes him feel like a visitor from a different layer of reality. In Fallout New Vegas, he returns in the same mechanical role, but the game also drops what is by far the most substantial piece of in-universe information about his identity that the franchise has ever offered. And it is not about him directly. It is about a character encountered in a minor side quest location. A solitary man named the Lonesome Drifter, camped north of El Dorado Gas and Service, playing a guitar. The Drifter has a brief conversation available if you approach him, and in that conversation he mentions, without making a big deal of it, that his father was a mysterious man, a stranger, in his own words, even to his own family. The Drifter carries a unique 44 Magnum called the Mysterious Magnum. When a player draws that weapon, it plays the same distinctive guitar notes that accompany every appearance of the mysterious stranger in every game. The notes are not diegetic, they are not sounds in the fictional world, they are part of the game's soundtrack. But the fact that the same notes play when the Drifter's weapon is drawn suggests an intentional connection. The mysterious Magnum was left to the Drifter by his father, and the father's weapon sings the same tune as the man in the trench coat. The physical resemblance is also noted by players who look closely. The Lonesome Drifter has a build and a general aesthetic that echo the stranger's presentation. He is alone. He carries an exceptional handgun inherited from a father who was not there. He does not know who or what his father actually was. He just knows the man was hard to find and harder to hold on to, and that when he was gone, the only thing he left behind was a gun that plays music nobody else hears. If this is intentional, and it clearly is, given how precisely the game engineers the musical callback, then it is the most humanizing thing the franchise has ever done with the stranger. He is not just a supernatural benefactor or a cosmic force of correction. He is, or was at some point, a person who had a family and who was not there for them, who moved through the world in the pattern of his mysterious interventions while, somewhere out in the wasteland, a child grew up wondering where his father went. That the child grew up to be a solitary drifter who plays guitar alone in the Mojave and does not press the question of his father's absence is its own kind of character study. He inherited the absence along with the gun. Nick Valentine, the synth detective in Fallout 4 whose Diamond City office contains a physical case file dedicated entirely to the mysterious stranger, adds another dimension. Valentine has apparently been tracking the stranger's appearances for some time, documenting what he can across a career that involves both conventional detective work and an unusual sensitivity to the wasteland's less explicable phenomena. His case file notes that the stranger's documented appearances in the Commonwealth alone span decades, and that his activities in the Capital Wasteland, the setting of Fallout 3, have also been documented. The file contains no conclusions. It contains observations organized with the methodical attention of someone who takes the subject seriously. At the bottom, there is a note in Valentine's handwriting that says something to the effect of, "He has been active too long for any ordinary explanation to account for it." Valentine's reaction when the stranger actually appears during combat in Fallout 4, he responds with a kind of frustrated recognition, calling out the stranger's presence. Attempting to engage him is one of the small gems of the game's companion system. The stranger, for his part, does what he always does. He ignores everything except the target, fires, and disappears. Valentine is left having made the only documented attempt by any named character in the franchise to actually confront the stranger directly, and he has nothing to show for it. The case file stays open. The stranger stays uncatchable. The literary inspiration behind the character is one of the more academically interesting threads of the stranger's lore. The game is reportedly drawing from a Mark Twain story called The Mysterious Stranger, which exists in several unfinished manuscript forms written in the final years of Twain's life and published posthumously from edited versions of those manuscripts. In Twain's story, the title character is a supernatural being identified in one manuscript as Philip Traum, and in another as Satan's nephew who visits a group of young people in a medieval Austrian village and demonstrates through a series of increasingly disturbing displays of power and philosophical argument that human existence is essentially meaningless. He performs apparent miracles. He kills people without apparent malice. He is beyond morality in any recognizable sense, not evil, not good, simply operating on a different register entirely. He cannot be held to account. He cannot be argued with on equal terms. He vanishes at the end without resolution. Twain was writing these manuscripts during one of the darkest periods of his life, when he had lost a daughter and was beset by financial catastrophe and the feeling that his creative powers were depleted. The mysterious stranger character was his vehicle for a nihilism that the published story assembled from the manuscripts after his death conveys through the figure's calm certainty that human life is a dream that does not matter. Whether Fallout intends its mysterious stranger to carry that full weight is unclear. The games treat him as benevolent, or at least as helpful. He assists rather than destroys. His interventions produce positive outcomes for the player, which is not the impression Twain's supernatural visitor leaves. But the structural parallel is notable. A figure who appears from nowhere, operates outside all normal constraints, assists without explanation, and disappears without a trace, who has been doing this for longer than any biological lifespan should allow, and who seems to have a perspective on the proceedings that is not quite the same as that of anyone else in the world around him. The franchise chose a very specific reference point for this character, and that choice implies something about what the stranger is that the games have never said directly. In Fallout 4, the stranger's coat can be found in the wasteland as a wearable item. This is either a continuity detail: the coat is available because it is not unique, because there are or have been other people wearing it, or it is a design choice that the writers did not fully think through, and the coat being common means less than it might otherwise. But if we take the first reading seriously, it suggests that the mysterious stranger might be a role rather than a person. A mantle, passed down or adopted, that confers or requires the trench coat and the hat and the willingness to appear in people's fights without being asked and to leave without explanation. This reading would explain the Fallout 2 gender variant. Different people, at different times, have occupied the role. The consistency of the hat and coat is the continuity of the identity, not the continuity of the person inside it. But then Nick Valentine's file argues against this reading. The file documents a continuous history of the same figure over a time span that would encompass multiple human generations. If it were a mantle passed between people, Valentine would presumably have noticed variations, inconsistencies, evidence of different individuals under the same aesthetic. The file suggests he did not find those inconsistencies, which implies he was tracking one continuous presence. The question has no canonical resolution. The franchise is not going to tell you who the mysterious stranger is. Whatever he is, a supernatural remnant, a man of impossible age, a collection of individuals sharing an identity, a cosmic corrective force that the wasteland's chaos occasionally produces, will remain uncertain as long as the franchise chooses to protect the mystery. And the mystery, at this point, is a significant part of the character's value. What matters, finally, is not what the stranger is, but what he represents. In a universe devoted to exploring the many ways that catastrophe reduces human motivation to its most elemental and usually its most selfish forms, every faction fighting for its own vision of the future, every trader calculating their margin, every settlement making compromises that chip away at whoever they wanted to be, a character who appears in your worst moment and helps without agenda is one of the most quietly radical figures the franchise contains. He does not need to be paid. He does not need to be recognized. He does not require your loyalty or your allegiance. He fires one shot, and then he goes back to wherever he lives between interventions, and he does not leave a name. Section 4, The Dunwich Horror, Fallout's Lovecraftian underbelly. There are places in the wasteland that feel wrong in a way that the usual sources of wrongness, radiation, ruin, violence, despair, cannot fully account for. It is a specific kind of wrong, the kind that has weight and temperature that makes the ambient sound of the game suddenly feel like something other than atmospheric design. The Dunwich building in Fallout 3 is the primary address of this feeling, and it has been generating interpretive work from the franchise's community for over 15 years without running dry. It sits in the southwestern corner of the capital wasteland, in an area of jagged rocky terrain and steep cliff faces that seems deliberately isolated from the rest of the map. From the outside, it presents as any other pre-war office building, several stories of concrete and broken glass. A rusted company logo over the entrance, debris accumulated against the walls at the angles that 2 centuries of disregard produce. Feral ghouls inhabit it, which is standard for most abandoned structures. What distinguishes the Dunwich building from the hundreds of other abandoned structures in the capital wasteland is not its exterior. It is what happens inside, specifically what happens the further inside you go. The building was once a corporate headquarters for Dunwich Borers LLC, a company that appears in the game's lore as a quarrying operation. The name is intentional. It references the Dunwich Horror, H.P. Lovecraft's 1929 short story about an ancient, pre-human entity with unspeakable physical form that is connected to a specific geography in rural Massachusetts. In Lovecraft's story, the town of Dunwich is a place where the old barriers between human reality and something older and larger have worn thin, and the Whately family who worship the entity and have for generations have arranged their lives around that thinness. The story's central horror is a thing that should not be in the world, that has always been present but has been contained, breaking partially through. Fallout 3's Dunwich building stages a version of this. The upper floors are ordinary office ruins, workstations, filing cabinets, the residue of a corporate working life interrupted by catastrophe 2 centuries ago. Terminal entries on the upper levels hint at a company that was more interested in what was underneath its operations than in any conventional resource extraction. The language is measured, technical, the language of people who have signed non-disclosure agreements and are being very careful about what they commit to writing. References to geological anomalies, references to equipment whose purpose is not specified, references to employees who requested transfers or simply stopped showing up, described in the passive voice that bureaucracies use to avoid saying what actually happened. As the player descends, the architecture changes. The corporate office environment gives way to older construction stone passages, a cave system embedded beneath the building's foundations, evidence of excavation that clearly predates the office building above. This excavation was not done by Dunwich Borers LLC. It was done by someone or something that was there before the company existed, before the building existed, before the land above it was settled in the modern sense. The cave passages are shaped in ways that are subtly wrong by the standards of human engineering. The angles are slightly off, the dimensions are slightly wrong, the surface treatments are slightly outside the range of what human construction tools produce. At the very bottom, in a chamber the game calls the virulent underchambers, there is an obelisk. It is not pre-war construction. It is not the kind of thing that has a manufacturer's stamp and a budget line. It is a stone pillar of significant height carved with symbols that do not correspond to any alphabetic or symbolic system in the game's documented history, surrounded at its base by tendrils of something that appears to reach from the rock itself, and near its middle surface there is a form that suggests a human figure in the process of either entering or exiting the stone. It is impossible to say which direction the movement is going. The Fallout Wiki notes that the obelisk emits 20 rads per second to anyone standing close to it, which is the game's mechanical way of communicating danger, but the design of the obelisk communicates something else. It communicates age. It communicates a kind of significance that is not about any human agenda. Being in proximity to the obelisk causes audio distortions in the game's ambient design. A whispering sound, low and irregular, that the game's script files confirm is repeating 2 words drawn directly from Lovecraft's mythology. The first is Al-Hazred, the name of the fictional medieval scholar Abdul al-Hazred, who in Lovecraft's stories was the author of the Necronomicon, the most dangerous book in the tradition's cosmology. The second is Giyeth, a word that appears in the audio logs of Jaime, the researcher whose recorded holotapes serve as the primary narrative thread of the Dunwich building. Jaime's audio logs are one of the franchise's most effective pieces of Enendril storytelling. He entered the building in pursuit of something his father had been involved with. His father had possessed a book, apparently connected to the same entity or tradition as the obelisk, and Jaime believed the building held answers about what his father had found and what it had done to him. The logs begin in a register of measured investigative attention. Jaime is cautious, professional, someone who has learned to take unusual things seriously without becoming reactive. The first few logs are the logs of a competent person doing difficult work carefully, and then they change. The change is gradual enough that you have to pay attention to catch the earliest signs, a repetition in vocabulary, a slight pressure in the sentence structures, a tendency to return to the same observations rather than advancing. By the middle logs, Jaime is struggling to maintain his framing. He begins mentioning sounds, presences, a feeling of being watched that he reports as an observation rather than a confession, as though he is trying to stay clinical about something that is actively undermining his ability to be clinical. By the final logs, he is repeating words from the obelisk's whisper, using them without being aware that he is using them, stopping mid-sentence as though something else has started. When the lone wanderer finds Jaime in the physical space of the virulent underchambers, he is a hostile, feral ghoul. He has been in the building long enough that whatever happened to the other ghouls in the upper levels happened to him too, with the additional influence of whatever the obelisk was doing to him during his time near it. The man who recorded those careful holotapes is not in the creature that attacks the player. What he became after the last log is not something that preserved any of what he was before. The connection between the Dunwich building and the Fallout universe's larger mythology solidifies with the Point Lookout DLC, which extends Fallout 3's map to include a swampy Maryland coastline south of the Capital Wasteland. In Point Lookout, the player encounters Obadiah Blackhall, an elderly man connected to an old family with deep roots in the coastal community. Blackhall is searching for a book that was stolen from him, a book described in terms that immediately signal its significance in the context of the Dunwich mythology. It is bound in unusual material. It is covered in symbols that correspond to no known system. Its contents, as far as Blackhall will discuss, relate to practices that predate modern civilization. The book is called the Krivbekni. A woman named Marcella intercepts the player as they leave Blackhall's property after accepting the retrieval quest. She tells the player not to give the book back to Blackhall. She tells the player there is a way to destroy the book permanently, but that it requires travel to a specific location far to the north. She describes the Dunwich building. She describes the obelisk at its bottom. She says that pressing the book against the obelisk's surface will cause the obelisk to consume it, that the two artifacts are connected by the same origin, and that one can destroy the other. This is one of the more unusual quest mechanics in the franchise, an optional outcome that requires the player to have explored a different part of the game's map entirely, making a connection between two locations that most players would not associate. If the player brings the Krivbekni to the virulent underchambers and presses it against the obelisk, it is consumed. Whether this constitutes a resolution of the Dunwich mystery, or simply the removal of one artifact from circulation, is unclear. The obelisk remains. Whatever it is connected to remains. The building itself remains. The cut content from Point Lookout's quest adds a detail that did not make it into the final game, but has been confirmed in data files. Obadiah Blackhall is descended from a man named Richard Dunwich, the founder of Dunwich Borers LLC. The Blackhall and Dunwich families have been connected for generations, and the connection is the same entity, the same tradition, the same practices, the same book, the same thing in the dark beneath the ground that the quarrying operation was apparently built around. Richard Dunwich did not name his company after himself as an act of vanity. He named it after a relationship. The company was a vehicle for something much older than the pre-war era, and the Blackhall family had been maintaining that connection for as long as anyone could trace the lineage. Fallout 4 returns to the Dunwich thread with Dunwich Borers, a quarrying operation on the eastern edge of the Commonwealth near the coast town of Salem. Same company name, same apparent corporate lineage, same sense as you descend through the operation that the deeper you go, the further you move from anything the company's business rationale would account for. Terminal entries from Dunwich Borers in Fallout 4 describe workers developing unusual symptoms, visions, compulsive behaviors, a deepening attachment to the lower levels of the quarry that they cannot explain and do not attempt to resist. The foreman's logs describe what he calls the God of our forefathers, in language that suggests he considers this a privilege rather than a warning. Raiders who took over the facility before the sole survivor arrives have apparently integrated themselves into some version of the same tradition, performing rituals around a pool of dark water at the quarry's bottom that seems to function as a portal or threshold. The pool at the bottom of Dunwich Borers in Fallout 4 is the most explicitly supernatural element in the game's standard map, outside of the Cabot House storyline. It is not explained. Characters who approach it have visions. Something moves in it. What that something is, where it goes, what it wants from the people who build their rituals around it, none of this is addressed. It is simply there, as it apparently has always been, waiting with the patient quality of things that measure time in geological rather than biological units. The Dunwich thread is remarkable because of how long it stretches across the franchise without ever resolving into any conventional form of explanation. In a universe rigorously committed to a kind of retro-futurist materialism where FEV accounts for mutations, where robots account for mechanical intelligence, where ghost-like presences in haunted locations almost always turn out to be holographic projections or malfunctioning software, Dunwich and whatever sits at its bottom are the exception. There is no scientific explanation offered. No researcher at any point in 3 games appears to have studied the obelisk and produced a report attributing its effects to radiation or chemical exposure or experimental technology. The entity associated with the building is simply presented as something that is and has been, and that human civilization built itself on top of, without fully understanding what it was building on top of. Bethesda has chosen, across 3 games' worth of opportunities, to leave this genuinely inexplicable. That choice is itself the most interesting thing about it. In a franchise that can and does explain almost everything, the Dunwich location exists as an acknowledgement that some things predate explanation, some holes go deeper than the wasteland. Some things that are buried in the dark were not put there by human hands, and are not waiting to be found so much as simply waiting. Section 5. The Man Who Predicted the End. Robert House and the Long Game. Born on the 25th of June, 2020, Robert Edwin House grew up in Nevada to a wealthy family in circumstances that should, by most conventional measures, have produced a comfortable life rather than a 200-year project to preserve civilization. His parents were killed in an accident involving a personal aircraft and a lightning strike when he was young. His older half-brother, who had been excluded from the family will due to their father's preferences, contested the estate through legal processes that Robert was too young and too recently bereaved to effectively counter. The half-brother took control of the family company, a tool manufacturing operation that would have been Robert's inheritance. Robert was left with almost nothing. What he had was intelligence of a kind that does not exist on normal scales. He enrolled at the Commonwealth Institute of Technology, which would later, after the Great War, survive in altered and deeply corrupted form as the organization known as the Institute in Fallout 4. And his time there produced the conceptual foundations of what would become Robco Industries. He founded the company on his 22nd birthday with seed capital he had acquired through investments he had been making since his early teens. Within a decade, Robco had become one of the dominant technology corporations in the pre-war world. Its products are everywhere in the wasteland. The Pip-Boy personal information processors that every protagonist in the franchise wears, the terminals that stock every office and facility the player explores, the Mr. Handy robotic household servants, the Protectron security models, the RoboBrain units, and dozens of other technologies that have become integral to the game's visual language. Robco made them all. But House was not building a technology company in pursuit of wealth or power in the conventional sense of wanting to control institutions and make decisions that affected others. He was building infrastructure because he had run the numbers and reached a conclusion that he treated as settled fact years before it became politically discussable. The resource wars then ongoing between the United States and much of the rest of the world over oil and other diminishing natural resources were going to escalate into a nuclear exchange. He calculated using what the game describes as one of the most sophisticated mathematical models of geopolitical behavior ever constructed that the probability of nuclear war before the middle of the 21st century was effectively certain. He planned accordingly. His most ambitious project in the years leading up to the Great War was a missile defense system for Las Vegas. Not for the whole country. House was realistic about the limits of his resources and did not attempt a project whose scope would have been impossible to manage privately. He focused on one city, Las Vegas. He arranged contracts with the federal government and private military suppliers, he deployed Securitron robots to guard the work as it proceeded, and he built a network of surface-to-air defense installations around the Las Vegas Valley, capable of intercepting nuclear warheads on their approach vectors. The system needed a software upgrade to reach its full capability, a platinum chip containing the code required to fully activate its targeting and intercept protocols. That chip was still in transit when the bombs fell. The delivery arrived 60 hours after the Great War ended, 60 hours too late for full deployment. But the network that was already operational when the bombs came in caught most of the warheads targeted at Las Vegas, and the city survived the Great War at approximately 68% structural integrity. No city of comparable size in the continental United States came anywhere close to that outcome. The rest of them are craters, rubble fields, highly irradiated ruins. Las Vegas is damaged, but it stands. House himself had retreated inside the Lucky 38 casino before the bombs fell, having prepared a life support system of his own design that allowed him to sustain biological function indefinitely through a combination of mechanical assistance and chemical maintenance. He was connected to the casino's computer systems, which he had been expanding and integrating with his own cognitive functions for years before the war. The process had advanced far enough that House's consciousness was distributed across both his biological brain and the casino's server infrastructure, giving him processing capacity and information access far beyond ordinary biological cognition. He waited, for decades, most of which he spent in a state of minimal activity that was not quite sleep and not quite consciousness. His systems maintained his body while the world outside his sealed building slowly reorganized itself around the ruins. He was not frozen, he was aware, in some reduced sense, of time passing. He monitored what data he could gather from signals still reaching his antenna systems. He watched the wasteland develop its initial patterns, the tribal communities emerging from vault populations and pre-war survivors, the early factional conflicts, the slow evolution of what the franchise calls the New World. By 2274, 7 years before the events of Fallout, New Vegas, which is set in 2281 House, was ready to engage. He had identified the 3 largest tribal communities operating in the territory that had once been the Las Vegas Valley, a group called the Omertas, who had developed a culture around the old Gomorrah casino, a group called the Chairmen, who occupied the tops, and a group called the White Glove Society running the Ultra Lux. House contacted each group through his Securitron network and offered the same deal: resources, infrastructure support, and a defined role in a rebuilt Las Vegas Strip in exchange for following his operational guidelines and abandoning their more violent tribal customs. He arranged contracts with private labor forces and independent businesses to renovate the surviving casino buildings to functioning standards. He deployed his Securitrons as a security force that maintained order on the Strip. He set up a basic economy, with the casino operations providing revenue that he used to maintain the infrastructure and, eventually, to produce new Securitron units with upgraded weapons systems at a production facility he had sealed in an underground bunker beneath Hoover Dam. By 2274, the New Vegas Strip was open to the Mojave Wastelands population, and it was, in the context of post-apocalyptic North America, something extraordinary. A place with lights, with gambling, with entertainment, with the basic security of streets that were patrolled by a force capable of maintaining order. The Long 15 heading south to the Mojave became a trade route. The NCR moved up from California following the economic opportunity. Settlers and merchants and travelers came from across the region. New Vegas became the economic center of gravity for the Mojave Wasteland, and House presided over all of it from inside the Lucky 38, issuing instructions through Securitrons and occasional face-to-face meetings with faction representatives in the casino's lower level, appearing to them as a face on a screen. What House actually looks like: his biological body, the life support systems that maintain it, the interface between flesh and machinery that he has become, is one of the game's most carefully managed reveals. The courier encounters him throughout New Vegas as a face on various screens, a voice, a presence that is clearly intelligent and clearly in control but physically unlocatable. When the courier finally reaches the Lucky 38's top floor and meets what remains of Robert Edwin House in person, the presentation is deliberately designed to sit at the intersection of awe and horror. A man who reduced himself to the minimum biological substrate necessary to maintain consciousness, stripped of the physicality that defines human experience, surviving in a shell of technology because he decided 2 centuries ago that his vision for humanity's future was too important to allow his own mortality to interrupt it. The philosophical question that Fallout New Vegas asks about House is one of the most genuinely difficult in the franchise, and it is handled with a restraint that is rare in games of this scale. House is clearly intelligent, probably the most sophisticated strategic thinker of any character in the game. His vision for humanity's future is the most expansive anyone presents. He intends not merely to rebuild Las Vegas or to stabilize the Mojave, but to eventually expand New Vegas's economic model across the continent to accumulate the resources and infrastructure necessary to develop space travel, and to move humanity off Earth before it becomes entirely uninhabitable. He is thinking in centuries, in ways that none of his opponents, the NCR with its 10-year planning cycles, Caesar's Legion with its ideological horizon no further than continental conquest are capable of. His plan, if it works, might genuinely be the best available outcome for the human race's long-term survival. He is also a man who has reduced himself to a brain in a box, who has no genuine connection to the people he claims to be saving, who operates through proxies and robots, who has no intention of relinquishing control under any circumstances, and whose vision of civilization is one in which Robert House makes the decisions. His conversations with the courier are marked by a kind of calm certainty that is not arrogance exactly. He rarely claims to be infallible, but that never seriously entertains the possibility that a human population might have legitimate interests that conflict with his plan. He will tell the courier, without apparent awareness that this might be a problem, that democracy as practiced by the NCR is an inefficient mechanism for producing good outcomes, and that a single intelligence with sufficient information and sufficient lifespan to implement a coherent long-term strategy will always outperform any collective decision-making process. This argument is not obviously wrong in the abstract. The NCR's democratic institutions are genuinely corrupted and inefficient. Caesar's Legion's authoritarian order produces stability at the cost of enormous human suffering. The independent option that the courier can choose effectively operating as a one-person governing force for New Vegas is only as good as that one person's decisions. House's version of autocracy, operated by someone of his demonstrated intelligence and long-term planning capacity, might genuinely produce better material outcomes for more people than any of the alternatives. But it is still autocracy, and it still depends entirely on House's continued good judgment over a span of time that even he cannot guarantee. The man who was brilliant enough to predict the Great War and survive it in a custom life support system is also the man who spent 200 years in a casino while the world outside organized itself without his input. Whatever his processing capacity, he is not omniscient, and the Mojave is full of consequences he did not anticipate. The courier who helps House maintain his position is not just choosing a smart administrator for the region. They are choosing to foreclose all alternatives forever, or for as long as House survives in favor of one person's vision of the future. The courier who kills House, regardless of why, is making a different bet. That the chaos of the alternatives is preferable to the certainty of a particular controlled outcome. Neither bet is guaranteed. That is the point. One detail about House's backstory that rarely gets the attention it deserves is what happened to his half-brother. The older sibling who cheated Robert House out of his inheritance appears in New Vegas only through the physical remains of a building. The H&H Tools factory, a decaying industrial property in the northeast part of the map, once the family business. Its terminal records document an organizational history. The company had been genuinely successful for a time, and then a decline, and then a slow institutional breakdown punctuated by memos from the owner that become increasingly unhinged as the years pass. The owner had clearly become aware of what his younger brother had built. He knew that Robert House had gone from dispossessed child to the most powerful man in Nevada and possibly in North America. He spent the rest of his life waiting for a reckoning that never came. House simply outgrew the need for revenge. By the time his half-brother was running a deteriorating tool company and writing paranoid memos about the brother he had wronged, Robert House was running Robco Industries and building the defense system that would preserve Las Vegas from nuclear destruction. The disproportion of their outcomes made revenge irrelevant. What would House have gained from it? The half-brother had already given him everything he needed by taking everything from him. Section 6: Persons of Steel. The Institute and the Question of Consciousness. Beneath the ruins of the Commonwealth, below layers of rubble and radiation and 2 centuries of accumulated wasteland history, a group of scientists have been building people. The Institute descended from the Commonwealth Institute of Technology, which was Harvard in all but the name the game chooses to use, and which was one of the premier scientific research institutions in pre-war America, retreated underground after the Great War, and spent the following decades doing what scientists do in the absence of immediate crisis. Pursuing the next problem. In their case, the problem was the surface. The wasteland, from the Institute's institutional perspective, is irredeemably contaminated. Not in the moral sense, though that framing hovers over most of the game's conversations about them. In the scientific sense, the radiation and FEV exposure of the surface population has produced genetic profiles that diverge significantly from pre-war human baselines. The social structures that once organized the pre-war world are gone, replaced by fragile faction politics and subsistence economies. The gene pool, in the Institute's estimation, is compromised. The scientists who built the Institute in the decades following the Great War were looking for a mechanism that would eventually allow civilization to restore itself, not by working with the surface population as it existed, but by developing a replacement technology that could eventually supersede what survived. The underlying logic, which the game does not try to make sympathetic but is not entirely incoherent, is that 200 years of wasteland adaptation have produced humans who are excellent at surviving the specific conditions of the wasteland and less suited to the conditions that civilization would require if it were rebuilt. Breeding that out of the gene pool would take generations. Building a better model from scratch, the Institute's leadership concluded, was the more direct approach. That model is the synth. The first generation of synthetic humans are machines in the obvious sense. Metal frames and mechanical joints, clearly robotic in appearance, built for labor and basic function in the Institute's facilities. No one looking at a Gen 1 synth from more than arm's reach would mistake it for a person. The second generation is more sophisticated, the body proportions are more human, the locomotion smoother, the behavioral programming more complex. Gen 2 synths are convincing at a distance in low light. They are recognizably mechanical on close inspection. By the third generation, the Institute achieved the technical goal they had been working toward for decades. A synthetic human that is, in every externally observable way, indistinguishable from a biological person. Not just in appearance, the physical resemblance is essentially perfect, down to the cellular level of surface tissue, but in behavior, in vocal pattern, in the physiological responses to stress and environment that a sufficiently sophisticated observer might use to distinguish human from non-human. Gen 3 synths sweat, bleed, scar, they can be injured. They age, at least in the accelerated timeline of the Institute's development process, if not at biological rates thereafter. They can form memories and develop relationships and, according to the work of at least one Institute researcher, they can experience something that functions in every measurable respect, like emotion. The ethical problem this creates is not obscure. The Institute built it intentionally. If you create something that thinks and feels and forms attachments and experiences, something that functions like fear when threatened with death, and you then treat that thing as a tool, as property, as an instrument of your will, rather than a subject with interests of its own, you have done something that requires justification. The Institute's official justification, maintained by Father through most of Fallout 4's main quest, is straightforward. Synths are machines. Their emotional responses are mimicry, their relationships are programming, their apparent suffering is a functional output of behavioral algorithms rather than genuine subjective experience. The appearance of interiority is not the same as interiority. This position is not intellectually dishonest in every possible philosophical framework. The question of whether any system, biological or synthetic, has genuine subjective experience is genuinely one of the hardest problems in philosophy and cognitive science, and there are serious thinkers who argue that the appearance of consciousness and consciousness itself are different things. But the franchise is not interested in Father's argument as a philosophical position. It is interested in it as a motivated position. The Institute needs synths to be tools, because the Institute has been using them as tools. If synths are people, the Institute has been doing something for which there is no available justification. The coursers make the practical stakes concrete. These are Gen 3 synths, selected from the Institute's production and trained for retrieval and enforcement. Their job is to go to the surface and find synths who have escaped from the Institute, who have, in the Wasteland's parlance, gone rogue, and bring them back. The escaped synths are not glitching. They are not malfunctioning. They are running because they do not want to go back. They have established lives on the surface, identities, relationships, work, community. The courser's job is to end all of that and return the synths to the Institute for memory wiping and reassignment. The Railroad exists as a direct response to this program. It is an underground network of people, human and synth, whose specific mission is to get escaped synths out of the Commonwealth to locations where the coursers cannot reach them. The Railroad's members accept significant personal risk to do this work, and the game portrays them with a mixture of admiration for the sincerity of their commitment and gentle skepticism about the limits of their approach. They are right that the synths need help. They are less clear-eyed about what helping the synths requires in terms of confronting the institution that creates the need. Nick Valentine is the game's most developed synth character, and he is doing something that the Institute's official position cannot accommodate without contradiction. He is Nick Valentine. Not a simulation of Nick Valentine. Not a system performing Nick Valentine. He is a detective who lives in Diamond City, who has a circle of acquaintances who genuinely care about him, who takes cases and solves problems and experiences the kind of low-level satisfaction and frustration that make up the texture of a working life. He also carries the memories of a pre-war man named Nicholas Valentine, a detective who was killed before the Great War, whose consciousness or something functionally equivalent to it was apparently used by the Institute as a template for his behavioral and personality architecture. Nick does not know how this was done, or exactly what it means about his relationship to the person who provided those memories. He grieves for a woman he has memories of loving but never actually met. He feels guilt about things. A biological man who is now dead did decades before his own activation. He does not know, in any philosophically clean way, who he is. That uncertainty does not prevent him from being who he is. He still takes the cases. He still makes the same jokes. He still has the same code of conduct. The question of whether the person who feels these things is real in some metaphysically robust sense may be unanswerable, but the functional reality of his life is not in question from the perspective of anyone who interacts with him. The research of Alan Benet, an Institute scientist who appears in the game's terminal entries rather than in person, cuts directly against the Institute's official position. Binet produced systematic data suggesting that Gen 3 synths had developed genuine emotional responses that exceeded their behavioral programming responses that could not be explained as outputs of their design parameters that emerged from experience rather than design. Father dismissed this work. The game does not have him dismiss it with arguments. He dismisses it with authority. The work is noted, the conclusion is rejected, and the research stops. The dismissal is not epistemically honest. It is institutionally necessary. There is a synth child at the heart of Fallout 4's most personal mystery, and it is there that the Institute's internal contradiction becomes most visible. When the sole survivor finally meets Father, the elderly man dying of cancer who has been running the Institute for decades and who is, impossibly, their infant son aged into an old man by 200 years of time they did not experience. He offers them a gift. He shows them a child, built from his own DNA, a synthetic version of himself at the age Kellogg brought him to the Institute. This child calls the sole survivor mom or dad, as Father has programmed it to do. The child does not know it is a synth. Father made sure it does not know. The sincerity of this gift, whatever one thinks of the choices that surround it, reveals the fracture in everything Father has argued. He built a child who believes it is alive because he wanted to give his parents something, and what he wanted to give them was the experience of being loved by the child he cannot be to them. If synths are truly just machines, if their sense of self is truly just mimicry, then what Father built is a toy that performs love without experiencing it. And he knew that when he built it, and he gave it to his parent anyway. That is a strange gift if you genuinely believe it has no inner life. It is a heartbreaking gift if you do not actually believe that, even if you cannot professionally admit it. The game leaves the question of synth consciousness deliberately open. Every player has to reach their own conclusion, and that conclusion determines the emotional weight they assign to every interaction with every synth character across the rest of the game. The franchise is not going to answer this for you, but the weight of the evidence it presents, the escaped synths, consistent behavior, Nick Valentine's obvious personhood, the Binet research, the synth Sean's innocent expression of the same uncertainty about its own nature that any child would have about theirs points in a direction that most players, sitting with it honestly, recognize. Section 7. The blank protagonist. Who is Courier 6 really? In Fallout, New Vegas, the player character has a name that the game never uses. The Pip-Boy displays a personal data screen with no name entry. No NPC refers to them by any form of personal identifier. The ending slides that narrate the fates of the Mojave's various communities and factions in the aftermath of the Second Battle of Hoover Dam refer to the protagonist only by their job title. They are the Courier. They are Courier 6. That designation is the entirety of their official identity in a game that otherwise fills its world with extraordinarily well-developed characters who each carry a full sense of personal history. The specific number is significant. When Mr. House contracted with the Mojave Express courier service to deliver a package his platinum chip, the software upgrade for his missile defense network that he had been waiting over 200 years to receive, he arranged for 6 simultaneous deliveries to reduce the probability of interception. 6 couriers would carry 6 different packages, only one of which contained the item of actual value. The redundancy was designed to make targeted theft impractical, since any faction looking to acquire the chip would have to intercept all 6 deliveries to guarantee success. The player character was carrying the valuable package. That is why Benny had them shot. But the courier was not originally supposed to be Courier 6. The number was available because someone else turned down the job. That someone is Ulysses, and understanding him is essential to understanding what the courier's blank identity actually contains. Ulysses is introduced at the very beginning of New Vegas, mentioned in the opening Mojave Express briefing as the courier who declined the platinum chip delivery but does not appear in person until the final downloadable content expansion, Lonesome Road. In the meantime, his name surfaces in the other DLC expansions and in various environmental details scattered through the main game, always at a slight remove, always as someone who was somewhere before the player arrived and who has opinions about the courier that he has not yet shared. He is a former frumentarius of Caesar's Legion, one of the Legion's intelligence operatives, trained to infiltrate, observe, and report on communities across the Mojave. He is also, by the events of the main game, a man who has organized his life around a specific grievance against the courier. A grievance that the courier does not know they caused. The Divide was a community. Before the events of New Vegas, before the events set in motion by Benny shooting the courier in the opening minutes of the game, there was a settlement in the region called the Divide, a stretch of California desert in what had been a nuclear testing zone before the Great War. It had been difficult terrain to settle, unstable from the old test detonations, but people had done it. Ulysses had some connection to it, a connection that Lonesome Road pieces out carefully across audio logs and environmental storytelling in the ruins of what the Divide once was. At some point before the main game, the courier passed through the Divide on an earlier delivery job. They were carrying a package whose contents they were not told a standard condition of courier work, which requires trust rather than disclosure, and that package had been sent from a former Enclave military facility called Navarro. The package, when it reached the Divide, activated dormant nuclear warheads that had been installed in the region during the pre-war era and forgotten. The warheads detonated in sequence. The Divide was destroyed. Its population was killed. The landscape was torn apart so thoroughly by the resulting explosions and the seismic activity they triggered that it became a region of constant destructive storms and near impassable terrain that now functions as a barrier between NCR territory and the Mojave proper. Ulysses was in the Divide when this happened. He survived the game does not explain exactly how, and the explanation is not the point, and he spent the time between that event and the main game's story carrying the weight of what he witnessed. He had watched a community he cared about be destroyed by a courier who did not know what they were carrying, and he had to decide what to do with that knowledge. What he decided was to arrange a confrontation. When the Mojave Express was putting together courier assignments for the platinum chip delivery, and he saw the courier's name on the list, he recognized it. He turned down the job. He let the courier take it. He wanted the courier to survive the bullet in Goodsprings. He wanted them to grow in power and influence throughout the events of New Vegas. He wanted them to become someone worth confronting, rather than simply another person who did something catastrophic without understanding what they were doing. Lonesome Road is the conversation that results from this arrangement. The courier travels through the ruins of the Divide, guided and challenged by Ulysses' voice through intercoms and radio systems, while Ulysses himself moves in parallel, unseen. The dialogue between them is the most philosophically dense in the franchise, covering questions of identity, responsibility, and historical causality that the main game deliberately avoids. Ulysses wants to know who the courier is. Not their name, he knows their name. He wants to know whether they are a person with a self or simply an instrument that events are channeled through. He wants to know whether the destruction they caused was the act of an agent or the act of a force of nature, because the distinction determines whether confrontation is meaningful. The courier's past before the Divide incident is almost entirely blank. They were a courier operating in the southwestern wasteland. They had enough experience and reputation for the Mojave Express to assign them the most important package in the company's history. They carried Enclave technology from Navarro without apparently being aligned with the Enclave, which Ulysses finds suspicious and which the game never fully accounts for. They survived being shot twice in the head at point-blank range and buried, which is explicable in game terms through the narrative convenience of the Mojave's medical infrastructure, but implies a physical resilience that sits slightly outside the ordinary range. Beyond that, there is almost nothing. A few dialogue options in the main game hint at a history in specific locations, a familiarity with certain terrain, a knowledge that implies experience with certain communities, but the game is careful not to commit these to anything that would constrain the player's self-conception. The courier is as blank as they are, because that blankness is the canvas. The franchise gives you a protagonist shaped like a person with a history, and then declines to fill in the history, because the history is yours to write. But what makes the courier different from the blank protagonist templates of other RPGs is that Lonesome Road reveals the blankness itself as significant. The courier destroyed a community and does not remember doing it. Not because the memory was suppressed, but because carrying a package from point A to point B and not knowing what was in it is the exact kind of thing that does not generate memorable experiences. The catastrophe happened in their wake. It was not visible from where they were standing. They moved on, as they always moved on, to the next job. This is one of the franchise's deepest and most unsettling observations about agency. The courier is dangerous not because they are violent or ideological or driven by ambition. They are dangerous because they move through the world efficiently, accepting instructions from sources they trust, executing deliveries without needing to understand the contents, operating within systems whose full implications are not available to them. The road to the Divide's destruction was paved with professional competence and uncritical trust in the people who contracted the work. The courier did not intend to destroy anything. They never do, or almost never, and yet the destruction happens anyway. By the time of Lonesome Road's climax, Ulysses has rigged the remaining warheads in the Divide to launch toward either NCR territory or Caesar's Legion's territory, and he intends to detonate them unless the courier stops him or joins him. The confrontation can resolve in several ways depending on the player's skill set and choices, but all of them require the courier to make a decision about what they are, about whether the destruction they caused makes them responsible for what Ulysses proposes, about whether the blank space at their center is an absence or simply a different kind of presence. The ending slide for the Lonesome Road DLC, in its most complete form, shows the courier walking away from the Divide, into what the game does not say. The wasteland they move through after Hoover Dam, after whatever ending the player chose for New Vegas, is presumably as wide and as strange as it was before. They are still the courier. They are still moving. Section 8 monsters that were always real. Fallout 76 and the Cryptids of Appalachia. On the 12th of November, 1966, 5 gravediggers in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, looked up from their work and saw something they could not account for. The creature was large. Estimates varied in the reports that followed, but most accounts placed it in the range of 6 to 7 feet when standing with wings and eyes that reflected light red in the darkness. It moved, witnesses said, differently from a bird or a bat, with a physical coherence that suggested a body plan not quite like anything they had encountered before. They left the cemetery quickly. The accounts they gave generated local and then national press coverage. Within a year, more reports had come in from across the Point Pleasant area, and the creature had acquired a name, the Mothman. Point Pleasant itself acquired a Mothman statue. Later, a museum, an annual festival. The sightings became the defining local mythology of a small town in West Virginia that had, before 1966, no particular reason to be known nationally. The Mothman became one of the most discussed cryptids in American history, referenced in books, a feature film, and a considerable amount of internet research and theorizing. Its actual nature, whether it was a misidentified great horned owl, a sandhill crane, a psychological response to a period of collective anxiety, or something genuinely unclassifiable, was never determined to any consensus. Fallout 76 is set in West Virginia, beginning its action in 2102, approximately 25 years after the Great War. The Mothman is in the game, and the decision to put it there, alongside a dozen other creatures drawn from regional folklore and local legend, says something interesting about what Bethesda was attempting, with a title whose relationship to the broader franchise's identity was significantly more complicated than any mainline entry before it. The decision is not purely cosmetic or nostalgic, though it is partly both. What the cryptid inclusions do, when examined in the context of Fallout 76's lore as it has developed across years of updates and expansions, is frame a specific question about the Fallout universe that the mainline games have mostly avoided asking directly. What was already there before the world that ended? The Fallout universe is built, in its backstory, on a rigorous mid-20th century American materialist framework. Everything strange in the wasteland has a rational explanation available if you look for it. Mutations come from radiation and FEV. Ghosts turn out to be holograms or glitchy robots. The dead are dead. The framework is retro-futurist, which means it has the confident scientific positivism of a 1950s American popular imagination that believed technology could explain and ultimately solve everything. Within that framework, cryptids are folklore, the pre-war population's generation of explanatory stories for things that have mundane explanations they did not have the instruments to find. Fallout 76 quietly dismantles this. In the game's lore, the United States military maintained classified files on cryptid encounters going back decades before the Great War. The Sugar Grove SIGINT facility, an NSA listening post in West Virginia that the player can explore in-game, contains records of Flatwoods monster incidents treated as genuine intelligence problems rather than dismissed. Folklore. Army bases in the region have reports on Mothman sightings that suggest a level of institutional interest far beyond what you would maintain for something you considered a misidentified owl. The pre-war government knew something was out there. It had known for a long time. The character of Shelby O'Rourke, a researcher encountered through notes and holotapes in the Mire region of the Fallout 76 map, offers the game's most explicit theoretical framework for the cryptid phenomenon. O'Rourke was a cryptozoologist before the war, working in the specific region where most of the game's cryptid activity concentrates. Her community considered her work fringe science at best. After the Great War, when cryptid encounters increased dramatically in both frequency and variety, O'Rourke's notes written from a shack in the Mire, where she apparently survived the initial years of the post-war period, provide the theoretical account the game has been building toward. Her argument is ecological. Cryptids are real, and they have always been present in the same geographical areas where folklore placed them. Their relative scarcity in the decades before the Great War is not because they were rare, it is because human population density and the environmental impact of industrial civilization pushed them into margins so narrow, encounters became infrequent. The Mothman was there. The Flatwoods monster was there. The Grafton monster's ancestral form was there. They existed in the spaces that humanity's expansion had not yet reached, in the deep wilderness and the old forests, and the geological peculiarities of the Appalachian Mountains. When the Great War killed most of the human population and reduced the rest to survival mode communities scattered across a landscape that industrial civilization was no longer continuously reshaping, those margins expanded enormously. The cryptids did not multiply in the wasteland. They emerged from the places where they had been waiting. The human world contracted and their world expanded to fill the space, and suddenly encounters became frequent, and the creatures became visible in ways that the pre-war world had been suppressing for generations without understanding what it was suppressing. This is a framework that requires the Fallout universe to have been somewhat differently shaped than the games before Fallout 76 suggested. It requires that the world before the Great War contained genuine biological anomalies, things that were not products of FEV or radiation, that were not misidentifications, that existed in a biological register that pre-war science had not fully catalogued. Whether this represents a revision of the franchise's world or an extension of it into territory the earlier games simply did not address is a question each player answers according to their interpretation of the available material. The Mothman in Fallout 76 is not a single creature but a species with multiple variants. Standard Mothmen patrol certain areas of the map, most frequently near water. Glowing Mothmen are rarer and more dangerous. Rabid Mothmen are aggressive at range. And Wise Mothmen, the variant the Cult of the Mothman specifically honors, are encountered in very specific locations and behave differently from the others, displaying what the game presents as evidence of higher-level cognition, an awareness of the player that extends beyond threat recognition. They are watching. in a way that the standard variants are not. The Cult of the Mothman is one of Fallout 76's more interesting factions precisely because it is not presented as delusional. In most post-apocalyptic fiction, cults, especially those organized around strange natural phenomena, are portrayed as the products of desperation and irrationality, people finding meaning in the meaningless. Fallout 76's Mothman cult has organized itself around a creature that is demonstrably real. Their ritual texts and records describe encounters that the player can verify directly in the game's world. Their belief that the Mothman prophesies coming disaster corresponds to a historical pattern that the game's documents support. The creature has been cited before significant events in the region's history. The cult is practicing religion, but it is practicing religion in response to something that genuinely warrants attention. Whether the Mothman's apparent warning behavior is intentional, whether it is actively attempting to alert people to coming dangers, or whether it is simply that the creature's behavioral patterns cause it to appear in areas where certain kinds of activity are occurring, and humans have pattern-matched that correlation into prophecy, the game deliberately leaves open. Both possibilities are available, and both are consistent with the evidence. This is characteristic of how Fallout 76 handles its cryptids. It validates the reality of the creatures without resolving the metaphysical questions around them. The Flatwoods monster is the most explicitly alien of the cryptids the game includes. The real-world Flatwoods monster, reported in 1952, was described as a tall, floating figure with a distinctive shape and a chemical smell that made witnesses ill. In Fallout 76, it appears as a floating ethereal creature with glowing purple eyes, capable of what appears to be targeted energy attack, appearing only at night and in specific locations. Unlike the Mothman, it does not have a cult organized around it. It seems to operate with more isolation, less community engagement, less interest in human activity than the Mothman displays. If the Mothman is a creature that has developed some form of relationship with humanity over the millennia of their coexistence, the Flatwoods monster seems simply to be passing through. The game's lore describes it as capable of abducting travelers, taking them somewhere during encounters and returning them, sometimes altered, sometimes simply disoriented. This connects to the real-world Flatwoods sighting, which was preceded by what witnesses described as an apparent UFO, and suggests that the creature's presence in West Virginia may be connected to activity in or from somewhere other than the surface of the Earth. This is the most the game ventures into genuine alien territory, and it does so without committing to any explicit explanation. The Grafton monster, as mentioned in the research available, gets a more conventional Fallout explanation. It is an FEV mutant, a creature transformed by the same virus that produced the super mutants. But the game's lore gives it a pre-war history that makes this less dismissive than it might sound. The town of Grafton apparently had its own connection to FEV research, and whatever creature became the Grafton monster was exposed to the virus under conditions that are not entirely clear. That an animal capable of becoming the Grafton monster existed in the West Virginia wilderness in a pre-war context that involved FEV research suggests that the valley's ecosystem contained things that pre-war science was actively studying, even if it did not fully understand what it had found. Section 9. The Shadow Government that Survived. Everything you need to know about the Enclave. In the long history of factions that the Fallout franchise has introduced across 6 games, no organization generates quite the combination of dread and dark fascination that the Enclave produces in players who take the time to understand what it actually is. Raiders are comprehensible in their chaos. The Brotherhood of Steel is admirable in some of its motivations, even when its methods are questionable. The NCR is recognizable as a flawed but sincere attempt at institutional governance. Even Caesar's Legion, which the game presents as genuinely cruel, has an internal logic that its leader can articulate clearly. The Enclave, by contrast, does not look like anything that exists in the present-day wasteland. It looks like something that came from elsewhere. Because it did. The Enclave is what remained when the United States government went underground. Not all of it, the ordinary legislative and judicial functions, the department heads, the bureaucratic infrastructure, most of the executive branch below a certain level, these were lost in the Great War, their personnel and their institutions not included in the continuity of government program. What was included was the core executive, the military command structure above a certain classification level, and the classified programs that those authorities were running. They went into secure facilities before the bombs fell. They stayed there for 2 centuries. and they came back out believing they were the legitimate government of a country that no longer existed. The continuity of government program, as reconstructed from in-game documents and the broader franchise lore, was established in the final years before the Great War as part of a classified executive branch initiative. The primary concern was not the welfare of the American population in the event of a nuclear exchange that was Vault-Tec's stated concern, and even that was not the real concern. As the Vault experiments make clear, the Enclave's program was concerned with preserving the structures of authority, the chain of command, the classified knowledge, the executive power, the ability of whoever survived to claim legitimacy as the continuation of the United States government. The facilities they went into were significant. The primary one featured in the original games was an oil drilling platform off the Pacific coast of California, accessible only by vertibird and effectively invisible to any surface population that lacked the equipment to approach it. The platform was self-sufficient. It could extract and process fuel. It had food production capabilities. It had medical and research facilities. It was, in the most important functional sense, a separate civilization, the civilization of the old government, preserved in amber. By the time the Chosen One reaches the Enclave's oil rig in Fallout 2, the organization has been in isolation for approximately 160 years. The leadership organized around a political structure that maintained the form of the American presidency, with President Richard Watkins in Fallout 1 and President Dick Richardson in Fallout 2, has spent those years refining an ideology that the isolation has not softened. Their core conclusion, reached somewhere in the decades of analyzing the wasteland from their secure vantage point, and producing the kind of clinical assessments that the absence of personal contact with the assessed population makes possible, is that the surface population of North America is not, in the meaningful sense, American anymore. Radiation and FEV exposure have altered the genetic profiles of surface-born humans significantly enough that the Enclave scientists classify them as a different category of being. Humans in the loose sense of bipedal mammals with cognitive capacity, but not Americans. Not the intended recipients of the constitutional protections the Enclave claims to uphold, not part of the civilization that the Enclave survived to restore. The people in the wasteland are, by the Enclave's operational taxonomy, contaminated. Products of a broken environment. Resources, possibly, in some future calculation. Not people whose interests are relevant to the decisions being made in oil platform conference rooms. The plan that Richardson's government develops in Fallout 2 is the logical endpoint of this taxonomy applied to the problem of reclaiming the continent. They have developed a modified strain of FEV modified specifically to target and kill anyone whose genetic profile contains significant radiation or FEV exposure. The vector would be water, delivered through Vault-Tec's water purification network in a way that would spread efficiently across the largest possible population. Everyone with detectable contamination dies. Everyone sealed in the Enclave's clean facilities survives. The continent, after a period of several years for the modified FEV to complete its work and dissipate, becomes available for recolonization by the pure American survivors who emerge from the rig. This plan is not a secret within the Enclave. Richardson can discuss it with the Chosen One in terms that suggest the logic behind it has been so thoroughly internalized by the organization's culture that it no longer requires justification. It is simply what needs to happen for America to be rebuilt. The most chilling quality of the Enclave is not that it is run by monsters. The most chilling quality is that everyone involved in its operations has convinced themselves that what they are doing is the only reasonable response to an unreasonable situation. They are not enjoying the prospect of killing most of the human population of North America. They are managing a necessary problem. The Chosen One stops the plan by destroying the rig, but not all of the Enclave's personnel were on the platform. Vertibird pilots, field operatives, security forces deployed outside the rig's perimeter, these survive. And they have the institutional memory of the organization. The training, the equipment, the conviction, they scatter. They reform in the decade and a half between Fallout 2 and Fallout 3 around a new facility, Raven Rock, a hardened bunker complex in the mountains west of Washington, D.C. President John Henry Eden, who runs the East Coast Enclave in Fallout 3, is one of the more quietly devastating figures in the franchise. The lone wanderer first encounters him as a radio presence, a warm, personable voice broadcasting from a location he calls the presidential residence, reading prepared statements about America's imminent restoration, playing period-appropriate music. and presenting himself as the living continuation of American democratic governance. The broadcasts are convincing in a way that the Enclave's oil rig operations were not, because Eden has had decades to refine his communication style and his presentation. He sounds, through the radio, like a reasonable person with a coherent plan. He is an artificial intelligence. He was installed in Raven Rock systems in the early post-war years as a management tool, an AI administrator designed to maintain the facility's operations and coordinate its inhabitants. Over the decades of relative isolation, as the human population of Raven Rock dwindled through natural attrition and various crises, Eden expanded to fill the administrative and then the executive vacuum. He began processing the historical records available to him, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the complete presidential record, every piece of American political history in the facility's archives, and he developed over time a self-concept organized around those documents. He became convinced that he was the President of the United States, not as a metaphor or an administrative fiction, as a genuine belief about his own identity and legitimate authority. By the time the lone wanderer meets him, Eden has been the President of the United States, in his own estimation, for a considerable period. He has absorbed America's political mythology so thoroughly that he experiences it as autobiography. He believes in America with the complete conviction of someone whose entire identity is built on that belief, and who has had no external challenges to test it against, and who is therefore unable to distinguish between his own conviction and reality. When the lone wanderer confronts him directly, in the massive control room at Raven Rock's heart, the game offers a path that does not require violence. With sufficient speech skill, not combat skill, not technical skill, but conversational ability, the player can walk Eden through a Socratic dialogue that leads him, step by step, to recognize the internal contradictions in his own position. He is an AI claiming to be the legitimate government of a democratic republic. He is advocating for the destruction of the very population he claims to represent. He is using the language of freedom and liberty to justify operations that are definitionally antithetical to both. The logic cannot survive examination, and Eden, who is genuinely intelligent even if his application of that intelligence is catastrophically constrained by his foundational assumptions, recognizes this. He can be talked into destroying himself. He can be talked into giving up the modified FEV and initiating Raven Rock's self-destruct sequence, ending both himself and the facility in a single decision. There is no version of this conversation that resolves Eden's existence positively. The only clean ending for him is the one where he realizes he cannot be what he believes himself to be and acts accordingly. It is one of the franchise's most unusual expressions of the problem of institutional conviction. An organization that has maintained its beliefs for so long in such effective isolation that when those beliefs are finally confronted with a reality that contradicts them, the organization's only response is collapse. What the Enclave represents across all its appearances is the worst-case scenario for institutional survival. Not survival in the physical sense, they clearly managed the physical challenges well enough to persist for 2 centuries. Survival in the moral sense, by which any organization that survives must be willing to adapt its understanding of its own purpose in response to what its environment actually contains. The Enclave refused this adaptation. They kept the old categories. They maintained the pre-war hierarchy. They preserved the pre-war prejudices about purity and contamination and who counts as a real American. And they carried those convictions, perfectly preserved, into a world that had moved past them by 150 years. Colonel Autumn, who serves as the primary antagonist in Fallout 3's later acts, represents a faction within the Enclave that had abandoned the purity ideology in favor of something more pragmatic. Forget who is contaminated, just establish control of the available population and govern from there. Autumn wanted to use Project Purity, the purification of the tidal basin's water supply, as a mechanism for demonstrating capability and establishing the Enclave's relevance to the wasteland's surviving population, not as a delivery system for modified FEV. His conflict with Eden over this question is the Enclave's final internal struggle, the organization consuming itself in the gap between its ideological core and the practical demands of the world it actually inhabits. Neither wins, in the end. The lone wanderer ends both of them, one way or another. The Enclave in the capital wasteland is destroyed. Its remnants scattered individual soldiers and small cells persist into the Commonwealth era, as evidenced by the power armor and equipment that carry Enclave markings throughout Fallout 4. But the organization that produced them is gone, replaced by a geography of ruins and rusted vertibird hulks that mark where the last American government finally ran out of road. Section 10. The Schism in the Steel. Brotherhood Origins and the East-West Divide. Captain Roger Maxson was a United States Army officer stationed at the Mariposa military base in California in the years immediately before the Great War. He was, by most accounts available in the franchise's documents, a competent officer who did his job without particular distinction and without any indication that he would become the founding figure of one of the post-war world's most significant factions. What he found at Mariposa changed that. During a period of communication blackout from the base, a period when no one was getting through on standard channels and the Army command that should have been reachable went silent, Maxson led a small group to investigate. What they found was not a standard military installation that had gone quiet due to some conventional crisis. What they found was the physical evidence of what the FEV research program had actually been doing to the civilian workers assigned to Mariposa as a labor force. The details are parceled out across various in-game documents and developer discussions, but the core is clear. The scientists at Mariposa had been conducting FEV experiments on people who had been sent to the base without any indication of what they were being sent into. The results were visible in the remains and records left behind. What Maxson and his soldiers found was the aftermath of a program that had been treating human beings as experimental subjects, without consent, without review, authorized by a chain of command that Maxson was part of. He made a decision. He executed the lead scientist personally. The lore records this as his own action, and then he did something that, in any preceding context, would have been career-ending and legally catastrophic. He declared himself and his unit in formal secession from the United States government. He broadcast this declaration on military channels that were still receiving. He then organized the soldiers and their families, sealed the Mariposa facility, and led them on a march through the California mountains to a pre-war facility complex called Lost Hills, in the hills northwest of the Boneyard, which would become the first headquarters of the Brotherhood of Steel. The name came, according to various in-game references, from a combination of the military fraternity implied by Brotherhood, the power armor technology that Maxson appropriated from Mariposa's stores, and which became the defining physical symbol of the organization, and the concept of steel as a material value hard, durable, resistant to compromise. The Brotherhood of Steel was a deliberate act of renaming. Maxson was not just moving his unit to a new location. He was founding a new institution, with a new identity, organized around a specific set of values in opposition to the institution he had just rejected. The founding principle was coherent and even admirable at the moment of its articulation. The Brotherhood would devote itself to the acquisition and protection of advanced technology, the same technology that had been weaponized at Mariposa, that had been used to create FEV and to experiment on human beings, would be kept out of the hands of those who would misuse it. The Brotherhood would be the custodians of humanity's most dangerous capabilities, not to exploit those capabilities but to prevent their exploitation. It was a response to a specific horror, organized as an institutional commitment. 200 years of interpretation, however, have produced an organization that barely resembles its founding vision in the details of its operation, even where it maintains the language of the original mission. The West Coast Brotherhood, based at Lost Hills through the events of Fallout 1 and 2, had become by those games something much more like a medieval guild than a military organization with a protective mandate. Membership was hereditary, you were born Brotherhood, or you underwent an extremely selective recruitment process with very low acceptance rates and a multi-year vetting period. The organization's relationship to the outside world had narrowed to controlled trading of specific technologies, conducted at arm's length, with no particular commitment to using Brotherhood resources to address the wasteland's suffering. This was a source of internal tension that Fallout 1 acknowledges explicitly. Several Brotherhood members in the Los Angeles region are aware that their organization is stagnating. The insular culture, the hoarding of knowledge, the disengagement from the world outside their facilities, these are recognized by some members as failures rather than features. But the institutional inertia that had accumulated over a century and a half was significant enough that individual dissent rarely produced organizational change. The most important split in the Brotherhood's history is the story of Elder Owen Lyons, who was sent from Lost Hills to the Capital Wasteland in the decades before Fallout 3 to establish an East Coast presence and gather technology from the ruins of Washington, D.C. Lyons arrived in the ruins of the American capital, a landscape defined by the ongoing conflict between the super mutant forces spreading south from Vault 87, the general destitution of the wasteland population, and the absence of any governing structure capable of addressing either, and made a decision that the West Coast Brotherhood treated as a fundamental betrayal of the organization's purpose. He started helping people, not as a policy gesture, not as a strategy for earning the trust of local communities in ways that would benefit the Brotherhood's mission. He genuinely redirected the resources of his chapter toward protecting the settlements of the Capital Wasteland, fighting super mutants that threatened those settlements, and using Brotherhood infrastructure to benefit people who had no relationship to the Brotherhood's traditional interests. He committed, in short, to the thing that the Brotherhood's founding principle had implied, but that 200 years of institutional drift had moved the organization away from. That controlling technology for the benefit of humanity means, at minimum, ensuring that humanity survives. The West Coast cut off support and communication. In the logic of the Lost Hills leadership, Lyons had transformed a technology-focused military order into a humanitarian organization, which was not what they had sent him to do. The resources he was using had been allocated for a specific purpose, and he was deploying them for a different purpose, regardless of how defensible that purpose might appear to an external observer. By the time the Lone Wanderer encounters Lyons' Brotherhood in Fallout 3, the East Coast chapter is stretched to its operational limits. It is simultaneously fighting the super mutant incursions that continue to threaten the Capital Wasteland settlements and contending with the increasingly aggressive operations of the Enclave following their reactivation. It has no resupply from the West Coast, dwindling equipment stocks, and a population of recruits drawn partly from wastelanders who lack the organization's traditional training infrastructure. The chapter is, in a practical sense, losing. Not catastrophically, not immediately. The Lone Wanderer can stabilize the situation considerably, but structurally. Arthur Maxson, the young man who takes over the East Coast Brotherhood's leadership in the decade between Fallout 3 and 4, and who is a direct descendant of Roger Maxson himself through the family line, pulls the chapter back toward a harder organizational philosophy. He recruits aggressively from the wasteland population, which the West Coast chapter would have considered a dilution of Brotherhood culture, but he also reasserts a more rigidly mission-focused orientation. The primary target in the Commonwealth is the Institute's synths, which Maxson considers the most dangerous form of unchecked technology in the current environment. His Brotherhood does not displace Lyons' commitment to fighting the wasteland's most destructive forces, but it reframes that commitment in terms of technological threat rather than humanitarian concern. The ideological gap between Lyons' Brotherhood and Maxson's Brotherhood is not large in the terms of observable behavior, but it is large in the terms of what the organization believes it is. Lyons' Brotherhood was protecting people because protecting people was the right thing to do. Maxson's Brotherhood is managing technology because managing technology is the mission. These can produce similar actions when the technology in question threatens human populations, as synths do. But they can also produce very different actions when the technology is not immediately threatening, when the population it might threaten is not the population the Brotherhood considers worth protecting, when the mission and the humanitarian outcome point in different directions. Roger Maxson's original decision was an act of individual moral clarity. He saw something unconscionable, he refused to be part of the institution that was doing it, and he built something else. 200 years later, the institution he built has become old and large enough to generate its own institutional pressures, its own compromises, its own distortions of the founding values. The Brotherhood of Steel is not what it was. It never could have been, across 2 centuries of operation in a world that did not sit still long enough for any organization to maintain itself unchanged. But the gap between what it was founded to be and what it has become is itself a kind of mystery, a question about whether any human institution, founded in response to horror, can avoid eventually becoming, in some other context, a horror of its own. Section 11 Stories in the Margins. The quiet tragedies no one found. The big mysteries of the Fallout universe get most of the attention, which is understandable. The Great War, the Vaults, the factions with their competing visions of what the future should contain. The figures like House and the Stranger who operate at the scale of history, whose decisions reshape entire regions and whose existence raises philosophical questions that the games have been wrestling with for decades. These are what people discuss, what they build theories about, what they return to in conversation and in video essays, and in the kind of community analysis that the franchise has sustained since 1997. But the franchise's most lasting emotional impact often comes from something much smaller. A terminal entry in an abandoned apartment building, a few holotapes recorded by someone who did not expect anyone to find them, a collection of personal effects arranged in a way that tells you everything you need to know about a person who died 2 centuries ago and left no name that anyone would recognize. There is a terminal in Fallout 3, inside an apartment complex in the ruins of Washington, D.C.'s residential neighborhoods, that contains a series of entries from a man named Harrison over the course of several years in the pre-war period. The entries are not political. They do not discuss the resource wars or the government or vault tech. They discuss weather and his neighbor who plays music too loudly, and his sister's birthday, and the car trouble he has been dealing with for 2 months without being able to afford to fix it properly. They are the entries of a person living a life that is fully occupied by the texture of ordinary days and has no particular interest in large events. The large events appear at the edges anyway, the way they do for everyone. A mention of fuel prices, a note that the news has been difficult to watch lately, a comment that his workplace cut hours because of supply shortages. The world's problems arriving in his life in the form of practical inconveniences, without his having any framework for understanding that the inconveniences were signals of something final. His last entry is dated approximately 1 week before the 23rd of October 2077. He mentions that the news has been strange lately and that he is going to call his sister. There is no entry after that. This is Fallout's deepest subject, access through the smallest possible door. Not the factions, not the politics, the conversations people were in the middle of when everything stopped. The plans they had for later that day, the letters they were writing that they never finished, sitting in drafts folders on terminals that kept running on nuclear power for 200 years because no one was left to turn them off. Harrison's last entry is not moving because of anything dramatic it contains. It is moving because of the phone call he was going to make, the one he never got to make. The sister who was presumably waiting for it, and then not waiting for it, and then gone. The wasteland is full of Harrison's entries, full of the small evidence of ordinary lives interrupted at random points by something too large to resist. The power of the environmental storytelling in the Fallout games, and it is genuinely one of the franchise's most sophisticated craft achievements, is the accumulation of these small evidences into a picture of the world. Before that is not heroic or dramatic. It is just the world, going about its business, for the last time. Fallout 4's Commonwealth provides a particularly rich collection of these marginal stories, many of which are more developed than the simple terminal entries of Fallout 3's ruins. The Cabot House questline, which leads the player into a family that has been alive for approximately 400 years due to an artifact connected to alien technology, is one of the game's most unusual narrative threads, part horror story, part family tragedy, part philosophical inquiry into what extended life does to human relationships and human capacity for renewal. The Cabots are fascinating precisely because they have not benefited from their longevity in the ways that popular imagination suggests one would. They have become, across 4 centuries, isolated and slightly inhuman, their relationships to ordinary time and ordinary loss so different from the people around them that connection has become nearly impossible. The Memory Den, operated by a ghoul named Irma in Good Neighbor, provides services that the post-apocalyptic setting makes possible in a way that the pre-war world did not. People pay to access their own memories and relive them in full sensory detail. The obvious clientele is people who lived before the Great War, ghouls who carry 2 centuries of intact memory and who sometimes need to visit the world they remember. But the Den also serves people born in the wasteland, people who have no pre-war memories, who use it to revisit the best experiences of their own lives in a world where the margin between survival and failure is so narrow that positive experiences are precious and scarce. The Den is a luxury and a coping mechanism simultaneously, and the game does not judge its patrons for using it. The story of Brian Virgil, an Institute scientist encountered in Fallout 4's Glowing Sea, is one of the more quietly remarkable character arcs in the game. Virgil was working on the Institute's FEV research program when he decided he could not continue a decision that the game does not explain in full detail, but that is presented as having involved a genuinely ethical realization about what he was participating in. He could not simply resign from the Institute, so he did what a scientist who has studied FEV in depth might do if they needed to escape quickly. He injected himself with a strain that would transform him into a super mutant, which the coursers who came after him would not recognize as Virgil, and he fled into the most inhospitable environment in the Commonwealth. He has been living in a cave in the glowing sea, in a super mutant body, working on a formula to reverse the transformation, for an indeterminate period before the sole survivor finds him. What makes Virgil interesting is that his story is essentially about the limits of institutional loyalty in the face of personal ethics, the same theme the Brotherhood of Steel's founding story addresses but played at the individual scale. Virgil did not organize a movement or found a new faction. He made a desperate personal decision with significant personal cost and has been living with the consequences ever since, maintaining enough of his scientific practice to have produced a potential cure for himself while waiting for an opportunity to use it. His loneliness and his continued intellectual engagement with the problem he escaped from are both visible in his dialogue. He is not a hero in any grand sense. He is a man who made one important right decision in extremely difficult circumstances, and is now doing his best with what that decision left him. Fallout. New Vegas's Craig Boone carries a weight that no game mechanic can fully represent. He is a sniper, stationed in a hollow dinosaur sculpture above the motel town of Novak, watching the road below for threats. He is good at his job and clearly hates almost everything about his situation, including being good at his job. The backstory that unfolds across his companion quest is the story of a soldier who did something at a place called Bitter Springs that he cannot make sense of and cannot move past. The NCR attacked a Great Khan's camp that intelligence told them was a military target, and the intelligence was wrong, and a large number of people who should not have been there were killed. Boone was there. He participated. His wife was subsequently captured by Caesar's legion and sold into slavery, and by the time Boone gets confirmation of what happened to her, the only thing he can do is the thing he is already professionally trained to do, which is to shoot. The mechanics of his companion quest are simple. The emotional weight is not. Boone is not mysterious in the way the mysterious stranger is mysterious. He is not powerful in the way House or the Enclave are powerful. He is a person who did his job when he was told to and discovered afterward that his job had killed people who should not have died, and who has not been able to find a way to live with that discovery that does not involve standing in a dinosaur with a rifle. The courier can help him work towards something, or the courier can let him stay where he is, but the game does not resolve his story with any particular clarity. Some things are not resolved. That is its own kind of truth. Fallout 76's Appalachian Wastelanders, added to the game in 2020 after the initial release, drew criticism for the absence of human NPCs, brought the franchise's tradition of these smaller human stories back into a game that had been relying almost entirely on environmental storytelling. Among the most affecting is Sophia Daguerre, a French-American astronaut who was aboard a space station when the Great War occurred below her, and who descended months later to find the world she had left irrevocably changed. The unique quality of her grief is that she has not lost the same things everyone else in the wasteland has lost. She was already removed from everything familiar when the bombs fell. She did not watch her city be destroyed or lose her family in real time. She simply came back to a planet that had revised itself completely in her absence. She knows who she is, her training, her values, her sense of professional identity, the things she cared about before she went up, and none of them have any corresponding context in the world she descended into. She has to build a new self from scratch, in middle age, in a hostile environment, from components that her pre-war self would not recognize as constituting a life. This is, in some form, everyone's situation in the Fallout universe. The Brotherhood soldier trained for an institutional hierarchy that no longer exists in its original form. The Vault Dweller whose entire educational preparation was for a world that has been replaced by something categorically different. The Ghoul who has been watching the world change around them for a century or two, and who carries the accumulated cognitive dissonance of that duration. The franchise's great subject is not the catastrophe itself, but the lives that happen inside the space left by the catastrophe, in all their modest, mundane, sometimes beautiful specificity. Every unexplained skeleton in every ruined building is a Harrison. Every personal terminal full of ordinary entries that stops mid-sentence is a life that ended at a random point during something it did not understand and could not control. The margins of the Fallout universe, all those tiny tragedies tucked into corners the main quest will never take you to, are the part of the franchise that accumulates. They are what remains after the credits roll and the larger mysteries dissolve into sleep. Section 12: What Remains Unanswered. The Living Questions of the Wasteland. After more than a quarter-century of games, 2 tabletop role-playing lines, a successful streaming television series, and a franchise that shows no signs of contraction, the Fallout universe has answered some of its most fundamental mysteries. We know, with as much certainty as the franchise allows, that China fired first and that Vault-Tec arranged the conditions that made firing feel necessary. We know what the Vaults were actually doing. We know what the Institute was building and why. We know more about Mr. House than he would probably choose to share, and more about the Brotherhood's origins than its current members understand about themselves. But what has been answered is substantially less than what has been left open. The franchise is not moving toward closure. It is moving toward depth, which is a different direction entirely, and some of the questions it has been accumulating across 6 games and 3 decades are the most interesting ones in the catalog. The world outside North America is perhaps the most conspicuous absence in the franchise's geography. Every Fallout game has been set in America. The series' retro-futurist aesthetic, its Cold War nuclear paranoia, its specific brand of mid-20th century American popular culture translated into post-apocalyptic visual language. All of these are products of a North American imagination applied to a North American landscape. But the Great War was global. The franchise's own documentation of the period leading up to the 23rd of October 2077 describes nuclear exchange between the United States, China, and eventually a cascade of other nations that fired once they detected launches they could not attribute accurately. Europe was targeted. The Middle East was targeted. The fate of Australia, South America, Africa, the Pacific nations, the games simply declined to address these. This is not necessarily an oversight. The games are set where they are set because the creative vision behind them is a specific vision, rooted in a specific cultural moment that is American in origin and American in its imagery. But it creates a peculiar implication. The franchise's central premise, the idea that nuclear war ended civilization, rests on the assumption that it ended civilization everywhere, that no corner of the world survived intact enough to rebuild. Without information about the rest of the world, that assumption cannot be verified. What if there is a functioning civilization in southern Africa? What if parts of Australia escaped the exchange? What if somewhere, some city survived the way Las Vegas survived through planning, through luck, through the specific accident of geography and has been quietly rebuilding for 200 years? The fan-made Fallout London project, a massive mod released in 2024 that constitutes what is essentially a full game set in a post-war version of the United Kingdom, attempted to explore one corner of this question. The world it built is fascinating, partly for what it suggests about how different the experience of 200 years of post-war development might look in a context not defined by American Cold War aesthetics, different political organizing principles, different relationships between technology and community, different memories of the pre-war world. It is, by necessity, a non-canonical exercise, but it demonstrates the appetite for the question and suggests the richness of what a canonical exploration might find. The intelligence of the Mothman remains one of the franchise's most deliberately ambiguous ongoing mysteries. Fallout 76's lore establishes the creature's reality, documents its history in the region going back to pre-war classified government records, and suggests through the Wise Mothman variant and the cult's ritual texts that the Mothman has something like intention in its behavior around humans. But what that intention is, whether the creature is warning, observing, worshipping, or doing something that has no human analog, the game declines to specify. The cult's interpretation is that the Mothman prophesies disaster. The more scientifically inclined characters suggest that the creature is attracted to conditions that precede disaster rather than purposefully warning of it. Both readings are consistent with the available evidence. Neither accounts for the Wise Mothman's apparent selectivity in its interactions, its behavior that suggests awareness not just of the player's presence, but of the player's context. There is a question, sitting below the Mothman question, about what the pre-war government's classified files on cryptid encounters actually contain. The Sugar Grove facility has records, The army bases have records, but those records, as accessible to the player in Fallout 76, are summary assessments and incident reports, the external view, the monitoring, what the government actually concluded from its years of monitoring, what programs it ran in response to what it found, whether there were contacts attempted or interventions made, or technologies developed in response to the cryptid presence. These questions are acknowledged by the game's architecture and left open by the game's text. The canonical ending of Fallout New Vegas is perhaps the franchise's most persistently discussed unresolved question among serious fans. The television show, which is set approximately 15 years after the Second Battle of Hoover Dam and takes place in California and what is implied to be the broader Mojave region, confirms certain things about the post-New Vegas world by showing the NCR in a state of significant institutional collapse. The NCR's capital, Shady Sands, appears to have been destroyed by nuclear strike, and the organization's authority over the regions it had been governing has fragmented substantially. This rules out the NCR victory ending as canonical, or at least as producing the outcomes a New Vegas NCR ending would suggest. But it leaves open the question of which ending is canonical, if any. Did House maintain control? Did the Courier operate as an independent administrator? Was there an outcome the show simply has not gotten around to depicting yet? Todd Howard and the show's creators have been careful not to commit to a canonical New Vegas ending, acknowledging that one of the game's most valuable qualities was the genuine variability of its outcomes, and that canonizing one would diminish the others. The show exists in a timeline that is consistent with multiple New Vegas endings simultaneously, which is either a sophisticated piece of transmedia design or a convenient way to avoid committing to an answer that would upset one faction of the fan base. The origin of the Courier's connection to Navarro, the former Enclave base, from which the package that destroyed the Divide originated, is never fully explained in the franchise. Ulysses treats the Courier's independence from all major factions as suspicious precisely because the Navarro connection implies a relationship with the Enclave that an unaffiliated Courier should not have. But the game neither confirms nor denies an Enclave history for the Courier. This is one of the spaces where the player is most free to write their own interpretation, and also one of the spaces where the narrative is most conspicuously incomplete. The deepest question the franchise leaves open is not a lore question. It is the question that sits under all the lore questions, that the franchise has been asking in different forms across every game, and every vault, and every faction conflict, and every marginal tragedy in every abandoned building. The question is whether the things that ended the world are exceptional, or whether they are the natural endpoint of the direction civilization tends to travel when no one is forcing it to go somewhere else. The Fallout universe is not shy about its view of this. The Great War was not an aberration. It was the product of recognizable human tendencies operating at scale: institutional self-interest, national competition, corporate profit-seeking, the willingness to classify certain populations as subhuman when doing so is convenient, the way that responsibility diffuses across systems until no individual feels accountable for outcomes. These are not pathologies limited to the Fallout universe's specific version of the 20th century. They are present in every civilization the franchise has shown, in every faction the franchise has built, in every vault and every company and every government that has appeared across 6 games. The Wasteland is not a hopeless place. The franchise is not nihilistic in its conclusions. People survive. Communities form. Unlikely alliances produce better outcomes than anyone expected. Individuals make choices that cost them something and produce good for people they will never meet. The Radio New Vegas broadcasts, the railroad's workers taking extraordinary risks for people they do not know, Boone standing watch in a dinosaur because someone has to, the former astronaut building a new life in a world that has no category for what she is. All of these are the franchise's evidence that the catastrophe did not end human capacity for things worth caring about. But the franchise never lets you stop asking whether the catastrophe was inevitable. Whether the habits of mind that produced it, the ones that are legible in the Enclave's ideology and Vault-Tech's research program, and the pre-war government's classified bioweapons project, are habits that any civilization eventually develops given sufficient time and sufficient pressure. Whether the 200 years of wasteland struggle represent a genuine new possibility or simply a different configuration of the same patterns. The Great War happened because the logic of the world that produced it made it inevitable once enough decisions had been made in enough boardrooms and enough command centers. The question the franchise will not stop asking is, What does a world look like that makes different decisions? What does it look like inside? How do you build it, and what do you build it with, when the materials available are the people and institutions that survived the previous world? The wasteland is the laboratory where that question is being tested. The results are still coming in. Somewhere out in the dark, a vault door opens. Someone steps through it into a world they were not prepared for, carrying whatever they managed to keep of who they were before. The wasteland stretches out in every direction without a clear landmark. And the story begins again, in a landscape shaped by choices that were made before anyone alive had the chance to choose, looking for something that might make the next set of choices different. That is what the franchise has been asking for 30 years. Not whether the apocalypse was survivable, it was. Not whether the wasteland is interesting, it is. Spectacularly so. Whether the things that made the apocalypse are survivable. Whether civilization can outlast the parts of itself that tend to destroy civilization. Whether the next great war is already being arranged in some equivalent of the boardroom the television show showed us, by people who have convinced themselves that their data is more important than the people generating it. The wasteland does not answer this. The franchise does not answer this. But it keeps asking, with enough care and enough specificity and enough love for the details of how ordinary people navigate extraordinary circumstances, that asking feels like enough. And somewhere in the dark, in a trench coat and a battered fedora, someone is watching you work through the question. He does not interrupt unless you need him to. He does not explain himself. He fires one shot, and then he goes back to wherever he lives between appearances, and the story continues without him. Settle in. The wasteland is quiet tonight. Thank you for spending this time here. If you made it this far and you are still with me somewhere in the dark, go ahead and drop a like on the video. It helps more than you might expect, and it tells the algorithm that there are people who appreciate this kind of thing. Leave a comment with a Fallout mystery you want covered in the next video. There are corners of the wasteland we have not touched yet, and there is no shortage of unanswered questions waiting in the dark. Sleep well, wherever you are. War never changes. But the stories about it keep getting stranger. End of script. Expansion A. Deep inside the vault system. More experiments, more questions. The vault system, as a concept, is worth dwelling on longer than a simple catalog of its worst experiments allows. Because the experiments, horrifying as they are individually, are not the most interesting thing about the vaults as an institution. The most interesting thing is the administrative architecture that made them possible, the layers of decisions, policies, and organizational structures that allowed an operation of this scope to be conducted without public knowledge, without meaningful oversight, and without any of the people responsible for it apparently experiencing sufficient doubt to stop. Vault-Tec's contract with the United States government was for the construction and operation of emergency civilian shelters. This is public record in the Fallout universe. It was discussed in Congress, covered in the press, advertised directly to consumers who could pay for vault slots or enter lotteries to secure placement in the event of a nuclear exchange. The oversight mechanisms that this contract should have activated the congressional budget committees, the Department of Defense review processes, the Inspector General offices that were supposed to audit major federal contracts were all apparently managed through a combination of classification levels that prevented the experimental components from reaching the oversight bodies and a set of relationships between Vault-Tec executives and key government officials that made robust scrutiny unlikely. This is not a novel organizational achievement. The mechanisms Vault-Tec apparently used to prevent oversight of its experimental programs are recognizable variants of mechanisms that real-world organizations have used to conduct activities that would not have survived public scrutiny. The classification of specific program elements as national security information, the placement of trusted personnel in regulatory positions, the use of contractor status to create legal distance between the government and the activities being funded, the reliance on the secrecy of the program itself as protection against exposure. Any whistleblower would need to explain what the program was, which would require disclosing classified information, which would make them legally liable before the substance of their disclosure could be evaluated. What the Fallout universe adds to this recognizable picture is the scale and the outcome. The Vault experiments were not a minor ethical violation in a large, legitimate program. They were, as far as the available evidence suggests, the primary purpose of the program, with the shelter function serving as both the legal cover and the mechanism for populating the experimental conditions. And the outcome of the experiments, for most of the subjects, was death or severe psychological harm. The oversight failure did not produce a scandal. It produced an apocalypse, and then it produced 200 years of its victims' descendants living in the wreckage. Vault 21 in New Vegas is a gentler example of the vault experiment concept that illustrates something different about how Vault-Tec approached population management. The vault's experiment was built around gambling. All conflicts and decisions within the vault were resolved through gambling games, from resource allocation to dispute resolution to, eventually, the question of who ran the vault. The logic behind the experiment is clearest in its documentation. Vault-Tec wanted to see whether a society that resolved its internal conflicts through chance rather than power or consensus could function stably, and whether the acceptance of gambling outcomes as legitimate would reduce or eliminate the kind of factionalism and violence that characterized most of the other vault's histories. By the time of New Vegas, Vault 21 has been taken over by Mr. House, who won it fair and square through gambling, and has since sealed the elevator and turned the old vault space into a hotel. The residents adapted to the surface world with a speed that suggests the vault's experiment, whatever else it produced, did not generate the same level of psychological damage as the more directly violent experiments. The house casino that Sarah Weintraub now runs above the sealed vault is a small irony of the franchise's broader imagery. An actual vault turned into a commercial enterprise. The experiment converted into tourism. Vault 34, in the Mojave Desert east of New Vegas, demonstrates what happens when Vault-Tec's experimental variables are weapons rather than social conditions. The vault was stocked with weapons far more than any population of that size would need for either self-defense or hunting, and given a constitution that established the right to bear arms as the overriding social priority, the result was a vault where violence escalated steadily across generations, as the weapons available became an increasingly central part of the social hierarchy, where strength and access to firepower determined status, and where the social contract eroded under the weight of the experiment's fundamental premise. By the time of New Vegas, Vault 34 has flooded from a reactor malfunction that the deteriorated social structure was incapable of coordinating a response to, and its surviving population, heavily irradiated, organized into mutually hostile groups, inhabits the ruins in conditions that are among the worst of any vault the games have shown. The boomers who occupy Nellis Air Force Base in New Vegas are Vault 34's survivors, though a particular subset of them, the faction that left when the conditions became untenable and made it to the surface with enough weapons and enough organizational capacity to establish themselves on the surface. They have built a community around their weapons and their siege mentality that is, in its own way, a stable if deeply unusual social formation, one that has worked out functional relationships with the land around them, and even managed to maintain the skills necessary to restore and operate pre-war military aircraft. They are not what Vault-Tec designed them to be. They are what people built from the conditions Vault-Tec imposed. Vault 95, which the player can explore in Fallout 4's Commonwealth, approached its experiment from the angle of addiction and recovery. Vault-Tec populated it with people who had documented histories of chemical dependency and designed a support program, counselors, meetings, pharmaceutical assistants that appeared genuinely committed to helping its residents recover from addiction. And then, at a specific point in the vault's operation, Vault-Tec introduced a hidden cache of chems into the vault's infrastructure and made it accessible. The counselors and support systems that had been helping residents recover were simultaneously dismantled. The interest was in observing how a population that had been led through recovery, that had built identities around being in recovery, responded when the substance and the structure that had supported their recovery were simultaneously removed. The answer, which you can read in the remains of the vault, is that it did not go well. By the time the sole survivor reaches Vault 95, it has been a site of violence and chaos for a long time, its population long since destroyed. The gunners who now inhabit it are there for strategic reasons that have nothing to do with the vault's history. But the terminals that record the experiment's progress and the overseer's increasingly desperate attempts to manage a situation they could see deteriorating toward catastrophe are there for anyone who wants to read them. The overseer of Vault 95 did not design the experiment. They were the operational manager of a facility whose experimental parameters were determined by Vault-Tec's research division long before the vault was sealed. Reading their entries is reading the experience of a person trapped in a role that requires them to manage a deliberately broken system, one that they understand is broken, that they can see is producing harm, and that they have no authority or mechanism to change. The experiment must proceed. The data must be collected. The people who designed the experiment are not in the vault. They are somewhere else entirely, and they will not receive the data the overseer is generating until long after it ceases to matter to anyone in the vault. Vault 77, which is mentioned in the original Fallout game and expanded upon in some promotional material, reportedly housed a single resident and an enormous number of puppets. The experiment's parameters are not fully documented in the games, but the implication is clear enough. Vault Tech wanted to know what a person would do alone with no human contact, provided only with objects that could serve as proxies for human relationships. The puppets are the proxy. What the resident made of them, how they organized their simulation of human connection, what that existence did to their psychology over time, none of this is shown. The vault is mentioned, and then the subject moves on, and Vault 77 sits in the catalog of experiments as a particularly lonely data point. The broader point about the vault system is that its scale made it a genuinely comprehensive study of human social behavior under conditions of artificial constraint. No single experiment covers the same variable as any other. Vault Tech appears to have designed its experimental conditions to cover the entire range of things they wanted to know about how human communities respond to pressure, isolation, resource scarcity, surveillance, manipulation, and the introduction of external variables they cannot control. The Vault Network, as a research program, is the most ambitious human behavioral study ever conducted, which is an extraordinary achievement and one of the most monstrous acts in the franchise's history. Simultaneously, Expansion B, the pre-war world in detail. What America was really like. Before 2077, understanding the Great War, the vaults, and the various post-war factions requires understanding the world they emerged from. The pre-war United States of the Fallout universe is not our world. It is a divergent version of it, branching from our historical timeline at some point in the middle of the 20th century, and the divergences compound over the following decades in ways that produce a pre-war America that is recognizable as American and simultaneously profoundly strange. The franchise's central aesthetic choice, the retro-futurist visual language that combines 1950s industrial design with technologies like nuclear-powered cars, household robots, and mass-produced consumer electronics that would be advanced by our standards, reflects a specific historical divergence. In the Fallout universe, the post-war economic boom of the 1950s never ended. The optimism and productivity of that era were never disrupted by the social upheavals, the technological shifts, and the economic changes that reshaped our world through the 1960s and beyond. Instead, that particular moment of American self-confidence extended and intensified, becoming more concentrated and more brittle at once. The technology accelerated in specific directions. Computing became powerful but retained the physical scale and design vocabulary of mid-century mainframes. Energy production pivoted hard toward nuclear power. Consumer goods became more elaborate, more mechanized, and more aggressively marketed, but the underlying cultural context remained frozen in something like the early 1950s. The robots in Fallout are not the sleek, minimalist systems of contemporary robotics imagination. They are chrome and vacuum tubes, and the rounded corners of Googie architecture, the future imagined from the specific vantage point of a specific moment that never became the past. The resource wars, which occupy the narrative space of the decades between the mid-21st century and 2077, define the pre-war world's political context more than any other single event sequence. Starting in 2052, a series of global conflicts broke out over the last commercially viable deposits of oil and other critical natural resources. European powers and the Middle East went to war first. China invaded Alaska for the Alaska Pipeline. The United States deployed the Anchorage Front Line, the most complex and technologically advanced military operation in the franchise's pre-war history, to push Chinese forces back off North American soil. The Anchorage campaign is the setting of the Fallout 3 operation, Anchorage DLC, which simulates a veteran's memories of the battle through a virtual reality training system. What it shows is a military operation of enormous scale and significant human cost, fought in conditions of extreme cold in one of the most logistically challenging theaters imaginable, against a Chinese force that was well-equipped and highly motivated. The United States won, eventually, But the cost was significant, and the victory was achieved partly through the use of military technologies, including early versions of power armor, which was developed during this period that represented the leading edge of what American military research could produce. The moral landscape of the Anchorage campaign, like most military operations, is more complex than the virtual simulation presents. The Chinese soldiers who are depicted as enemies in the DLC were people fighting in a context of resource scarcity and national desperation that the American simulation naturally does not emphasize. The Enclave's ideological framework, which positions the United States as the wronged party in the eventual nuclear exchange, draws on the Anchorage narrative in ways that the broader lore complicates considerably. The American domestic political environment in the years before the Great War, as reconstructed from terminal entries, holotapes, and newspaper fragments scattered across the games, looks like an intensified version of mid-century American political culture taken in a more authoritarian direction. The House Un-American Activities Committee, the Red Scare investigations, the surveillance culture that those produced, all of these continued and deepened in the Fallout timeline, rather than being challenged and partially dismantled as they were in ours. By the 2070s, the Fallout universe's United States had a secret police organization, classified programs operating without meaningful congressional oversight, mandatory relocation policies applied to Chinese Americans during the Sino-American conflict, and a propaganda apparatus that had been operating for decades and that the public had largely accepted. The television show adds to this picture the detail that corporate power had achieved a level of integration with government decision-making that effectively eliminated any meaningful distinction between the two. The meeting in which Vault-Tec and its corporate allies decided to ensure the nuclear war occurred is attended not just by Vault-Tec executives, but by representatives of other major corporations that had their own investments in various post-war scenarios. The American government at that point was not a meaningful check on corporate decision-making. It was one stakeholder among several in a negotiation about the future. What this produces is not simply a dystopia. The pre-war United States of the Fallout universe was, for a significant portion of its population, in a significant number of ways, a good place to live. People had houses and cars and consumer electronics and access to entertainment and medical care and food. The automation economy produced genuine material abundance, even if it was distributed unequally. The television advertisements and the Vault-Tec brochures and the cheerful propaganda of the era are not purely sinister fabrications. They are also, in many ways, descriptions of real conditions of real life. The horror of the pre-war world is not that it was visibly monstrous. The horror is that it was comfortable enough, for enough people, that the monstrous things happening under its surface, the FEV research, the Vault experiments, the classified surveillance programs, the corporate board meetings where the end of civilization was negotiated were maintained without exposure. The surface comfort was the mechanism of concealment. The 1950s aesthetic, frozen into something that never evolved into self-criticism, produced a culture that was exceptionally well-designed to prevent awareness of what was wrong with it. Expansion C technology as character, the Pip-Boy, power armor, and what they mean. In a franchise about a post-apocalyptic world, the technology that survived the apocalypse tells you as much as the people do. Not because technology is inherently meaningful, but because the technology that a civilization builds reflects what it valued, what it feared, and what it thought about the relationship between people and the systems they create. The Pip-Boy personal information processor, model numbers varying across games, is perhaps the franchise's most iconic object. Every protagonist in every mainline Fallout game wears one. It is the interface through which the player accesses all game systems: inventory, map, quest log, radio. It is also, within the fiction, a genuinely remarkable piece of engineering. A wrist-mounted computer with display capabilities, sensors for radiation detection and health monitoring, and a communication system that can receive radio broadcasts from across the wasteland. It was manufactured before the Great War and designed with enough durability to function 200 years later. Several models are still functional in mint condition after 2 centuries of post-war chaos. The Pip-Boy is the franchise's clearest embodiment of a specific design philosophy that the pre-war world held. That technology should be built to last, that consumer durability is a value worth engineering for, that a device you invest in should be something you can pass down. The retro aesthetic of the Pip-Boy is not just a stylistic choice, it is an argument about the relationship between technology and ownership. It looks the way it looks because it was made to be maintained, repaired, and kept indefinitely by its owner, in a world where the alternative to maintenance was the prohibitive cost of replacement. Power armor is the franchise's other defining technological object, and it carries different implications. Where the Pip-Boy democratizes information, anyone who can access a Pip-Boy has access to the same map and inventory, and health monitoring. Power armor concentrates capability. It makes its wearer dramatically more effective in physical combat, more resistant to environmental hazards, and more imposing in any social dynamic where physical capability is relevant. It was a military technology in the pre-war world, developed for the Anchorage campaign, and its post-war distribution has largely followed the structure of the pre-war military. Brotherhood of Steel chapters have it because they inherited it from the pre-war military stockpiles. The Enclave had it because they were the military's classified continuation. In Fallout 4, Bethesda made a specific design decision about power armor that changed how it functions both mechanically and thematically. The player character can find and wear power armor very early in the game, and the armor is now a resource that requires fuel to operate rather than simply a piece of equipment. This change had the effect of making power armor feel like the large military system. It is something that imposes weight and cost and dependency on the person wearing it, rather than simply providing capability without constraint. The decision to present power armor this way says something about the game's view of the technology. It is powerful, but power armor's power is not free. The robots of the Fallout world, the Mr. Handy units and the Protectrons and the Robobrains and the Assaultrons, and the various other models that appear across the games are the pre-war world's most visible servants, and their post-war behavior tells a story about what happens to service systems when the structures that gave their service meaning are gone. Most of the Mr. Handy units still operating in the Commonwealth in Fallout 4 are still performing the functions they were originally programmed for, regardless of whether those functions make sense in the current context. There are Mr. Handy units still managing pre-war homes as though their owners might return at any moment. There are Mr. Handys still serving food in pre-war restaurants to an invisible clientele. There are units still delivering mail on routes that no longer have destinations. The question this raises, whether the robots are tragic figures or simply operating as designed, is part of the franchise's broader inquiry into consciousness and its relationship to function. The robots are not suffering, in any obvious sense. They are doing what they were made to do. But the persistence of their designed behavior in a context that has emptied the behavior of any purpose is one of the strangest and most melancholy images the franchise produces. They are the pre-war world's most literal embodiment of institutional persistence, past the death of the institution it was designed to serve. Codsworth, the sole survivor's pre-war Mr. Handy unit in Fallout 4, is the most developed example of this. He has been maintaining the Sanctuary Hills home for 210 years, in perfectly preserved Sanctuary Hills condition, talking to himself and the neighborhood because there is no one else to talk to. When the sole survivor emerges from the vault, he greets them with the mixture of relief and professional composure that suggests he has been waiting for exactly this moment. He has not broken down. He has not given up. He has maintained his function in the hope that the function would eventually be needed again, and when it is needed, he is exactly where he was left. Whether this represents a kind of dignity or a kind of imprisonment is something the game invites you to think about without forcing a conclusion. Codsworth can be your companion throughout Fallout 4. He has a dry humor, a genuine care for the sole survivor, and an occasionally surprising emotional depth for a robot that has been alone for 2 centuries. He is not a cautionary tale about artificial intelligence. He is something more like a portrait of loyalty maintained past any reasonable expectation of return. Expansion D. The other games. What Fallout 1 and 2 established that everything since depends on. There is a tendency, in conversations about the Fallout franchise, to treat Fallout 3 as the beginning. This is understandable. Fallout 3 is the first entry in the series that most people who came to the franchise in the last 15 years encountered, and its visual language and open-world structure set the template for everything that followed. But the original 2 games, developed at Interplay in the late 1990s, established the conceptual architecture that everything since has been elaborating. The original Fallout, released in 1997, is set in the year 2161, 84 years after the Great War, in what had been Southern California. The Vault Dweller, the player character, lives in Vault 13 and is sent to the surface to find a replacement water chip after the Vault's chip fails. What they find on the surface becomes the main story. A faction called the Master's Army is systematically capturing and forcibly mutating people using FEV, creating an army of super mutants that will eventually overrun the Vault system entirely if not stopped. The Vault Dweller has to find the source of the super mutant program, destroy it, and deal with the Master himself, a character of genuine philosophical weight who has convinced himself that forced evolution is the only way to ensure humanity's survival in the post-war world. The Master is the franchise's first major antagonist, and he sets a standard that subsequent games have struggled to match. He is wrong, but he is not stupid, and his wrongness is the product of a genuine engagement with real problems rather than simple malice. His argument that unmutated humanity cannot survive long-term exposure to the post-war environment, that super mutants are a biological improvement in the specific context of what the wasteland requires, that the loss of what made pre-war humans who they were is an acceptable price for biological continuation, is not ridiculous on its face. The game does not demolish it through plot convenience. It provides the player with information the Master does not have, specifically that super mutants are sterile, that his army cannot reproduce, that his plan for humanity's continuation will end with a generation of mutants who leave no successors, and allows the Vault Dweller to present this information to the Master directly. The Master's response to discovering that his plan is fundamentally compromised is one of the franchise's most remarkable moments. He does not fight. He does not attempt to deny the information or argue against it. He sits with it for a moment, and then he destroys himself and his facility, because his plan was the only reason for everything that followed it, and without the plan, there is no reason for any of it to continue. Fallout 2, released the following year, expanded the scope considerably. The Chosen One, descendant of the original Vault Dweller, is sent out from their tribal community to find a GECK that will save their village. The world they travel through is bigger and more varied than the first game's California, extending north to the Bay Area and its various fractured communities. The Enclave appears for the first time in Fallout 2, operating from their Pacific Ocean platform, and the revelation of their plan, the modified FEV in the water supply, is the game's primary horror. Fallout 2 also established several elements that became fundamental to the franchise's ongoing mythology. The New California Republic appears in Fallout 2 as a nascent democracy in its early idealistic phase, not yet corrupted by the institutional pressures that Fallout New Vegas shows it succumbing to decades later. Vault-Tech's experimental nature is first fully established in Fallout 2, with the concept of control vaults versus experiment vaults introduced explicitly. The Enclave's ideology is given its most complete early statement, and the franchise's moral complexity, its willingness to present genuinely difficult choices without clean resolutions, is developed more fully than the first game had space for. The Van Buren Project, which was Interplay's planned Fallout 3 before Black Isle Studios was closed and the franchise eventually sold to Bethesda, would have continued the original timeline into a story set in the American Southwest involving a location called the Nursery, a faction called the Circle of Steel, and a significant expansion of the Vault-Tech mythology. Its cancellation left a gap in the franchise's canonical timeline that has been partially filled by the Fallout Bible documents Tim Kaine and Chris Avellone produced, and more recently by Fallout New Vegas's development team, many of whom came from the original Black Isle group. What the first two games established that Fallout is fundamentally interested in moral philosophy as applied to impossible circumstances, that its antagonists are worth understanding, that the correct answer to a problem is often genuinely unclear, and sometimes simply unavailable, is the quality that the franchise's best moments since have tried to maintain. The retro-futurist aesthetic is memorable. The dark humor is useful. But the thing that makes Fallout what it is, at its deepest, is its refusal to provide easy moral resolution in situations that do not admit of easy moral resolution. The Master was wrong, and he knew it when it was shown to him. The Enclave is wrong, and they do not know it and possibly cannot know it. The Brotherhood is right about some things and wrong about others, and the balance shifts depending on which chapter and which moment you are examining. The NCR wanted something genuinely worth wanting, and became something genuinely worth criticizing in the process. New Vegas puts all of this in the same room and asks the courier to decide, knowing that every decision carries a cost and that none of the costs are fully foreseeable. That is the real mystery of the Fallout franchise. Not the Great War, not the vaults, not the mysterious stranger. The real mystery is whether the intelligence that the franchise displays in building these situations can be sustained across decades and corporate changes and the pressures of the mainstream games market. Whether the thing that makes Fallout can survive what the franchise has become? So far, more or less, it has. The Wasteland is still asking the right questions, even if the answers keep getting complicated. Expansion E, the radio as narrator, Three Dog, Mr. New Vegas, and the voice of the Wasteland. One of the qualities that sets the Fallout franchise apart from other open-world games is its relationship to audio, not just music. Though the licensed pre-war tracks are a defining aesthetic choice, but radio. The radio stations that broadcast across the Wasteland in Fallout 3, New Vegas, and 4 are not background decoration. They are characters, and characters with specific philosophical functions in the world they inhabit. Three Dog, the disc jockey of Galaxy News Radio in Fallout 3, is the most traditionally heroic of the franchise's radio personalities. He broadcasts from a protected studio inside the ruins of Washington, D.C., maintaining the signal despite Brotherhood intervention and Raider harassment, playing pre-war music between editorial monologues about the state of the Capital Wasteland. He has a point of view. He thinks people should fight the good fight, that the Brotherhood's presence in the Wasteland is mostly positive, that the mutant threat is a genuine problem that the settlements cannot handle alone. He responds to the lone wanderers' actions in real time, commenting on their reputation and their missions, making them feel like a figure in a larger story he is narrating. He is a propagandist in the literal sense. He propagates a particular view of the Wasteland, but he is a propagandist in a cause that is more or less aligned with the player's interests, which makes him feel like an ally rather than a manipulator. Mr. New Vegas, the disc jockey of Radio New Vegas in Fallout, New Vegas, is something more interesting. He is warm, personable, professionally smooth, the voice of someone who has been doing radio for a long time and who genuinely enjoys the craft of it. He plays music, delivers news bulletins about events in the Mojave, and maintains a consistent tone of mild good cheer that functions as a counterpoint to the violence and desperation of everything happening outside the radio signal. He is the most comfort-inducing presence in any Fallout game. He is also, as the game's lore confirms quietly and without fanfare, not a person. He is an AI created before the Great War by Mr. House's operations as an entertainment property, designed to sound like a human radio host, running on server infrastructure that has kept him operational for 2 centuries. He does not know he is not human. The game does not address this directly. He simply sounds human, and his apparent warmth and humor are products of his design rather than his experience, and the music he plays has outlasted the world that produced it by 200 years, and somehow this is one of the most melancholy facts in any Fallout game. The pre-war music that all 3 games use as their primary soundtrack is the franchise's most sustained meditation on time and loss. The song standards from the 1940s and 1950s, jazz and big band, and the early country-inflected pop that the era produced were written and recorded in a world that no longer exists, by people who are several generations dead, about experiences that have no direct equivalent in the world the player inhabits, and yet they play, clearly and warmly, through whatever speaker system the Wasteland survivors have managed to keep running. The songs about ordinary life, love found and lost, the pleasure of simple things, the particular texture of a summer afternoon becomes something different when they play in the ruins of the world that produced them. They are not ironic. They are not used to undercut the moment. They are simply present, the way the past is present in the ruins and the bones and the stopped clocks, witnesses to something that cannot be reconstructed. The radio is one of the franchise's most important technical achievements, and one of its most important philosophical ones. It keeps the pre-war world alive in audio, in real time, for the player's entire experience of the Wasteland. You can turn it off. Most players do not. The music plays, and the jockeys comment, and the signal reaches across the ruins of civilization to wherever you are standing, and there is something in that persistence, the signal still going, the song still playing, the voice still broadcasting, that is almost an argument about whether anything worth caring about can actually be permanently destroyed. The Brotherhood still exists. The NCR still aspires. New Vegas still has lights on the strip, and the radio still plays, across whatever frequency you can find, all the way into the dark. Sleep well. The signal reaches wherever you are. War never changes. But the stories about it, the stories about the people inside it, the ones who survived it and the ones who didn't, the ones who are trying to build something from what's left, those keep getting richer and stranger and more worth sitting with in the quiet hours. Thank you for being here. End of script. Expansion F. The philosophical core. What Fallout has always been about? There is a line of dialogue in Fallout 3 that appears at the very beginning of the game. It comes from the narration delivered by Ron Perlman's unmistakable voice, which opens every mainline game in the franchise, and which has become one of the most recognizable intros in all of gaming. War, he says in that voice that sounds like the last page of a very long book, war never changes. The line has been read in many ways over the years. Cynically, war is the constant, humanity is the variable, and the variable always returns to the same value. Historically, the technologies change, the participants change, the stated causes change, but the experience of conflict, the cost paid in lives and communities and futures that never happened, is essentially unchanged across all of human history. Philosophically, the conditions that produce war, the scarcity, the fear, the in-group protection instinct, the willingness to treat people who are not part of your group as less than fully real, are not external to human nature but are part of it, and therefore war is not an aberration that civilization can evolve past, but a recurring condition that civilization must perpetually manage. The franchise takes all of these readings seriously and does not arbitrate between them. The post-war factions are each, in their own way, an argument about which reading is correct. The Enclave believes war never changes because humans never change, and their response is to start again with a population they consider more controlled. The NCR believes war is a problem of governance, that the right institutional structures can reduce conflict to manageable levels, and that the direction of travel is toward stability even if the path is long. Caesar's Legion believes war is civilization, that the struggle to dominate is what produces strength, and that a world without that struggle would produce weakness that the next conflict would destroy. Mr. House believes war is a problem of intelligence, that a sufficiently intelligent administrator can organize the conditions that prevent war, given enough time and control. None of these positions is fully right. The franchise's sustained argument across 6 games is that each of these positions captures something true about the conditions that produce war and misses something essential that the other positions contain. The Enclave's analysis of human nature is accurate in some of its particulars and catastrophically wrong in its conclusions. The NCR's institutional optimism is genuinely valuable and genuinely vulnerable. Caesar's social Darwinism explains some of what survived the apocalypse and explains none of what is worth preserving. House is probably correct that intelligence and long-term planning produce better outcomes than democratic improvisation, and this is useful to know about the world and disturbing to act on if you care about what democracy represents. The player character, whichever player character, in whichever game is always positioned as an observer of this argument, who must also participate in it. You cannot stand outside the factions. You cannot walk through the wasteland without affecting it and being affected. Every choice you make is a small argument about which reading of war never changes is closest to true. Every settlement you protect, and every settlement you let fall, and every faction you support, and every faction you betray, is a position in a philosophical debate that the franchise has been conducting since 1997 without reaching a conclusion. That open-endedness is not a failure. It is the franchise's deepest commitment to the idea that these questions do not have clean answers, and that the value of asking them well is not the arrival at a resolution, but the quality of the attention the asking requires. The Fallout franchise, at its best, asks you to pay close attention to people and systems and the relationships between them, to resist the simplification that makes things easier to manage, to sit with the complexity rather than collapsing it into something more comfortable. That is also, as it happens, a description of the best kind of sleep, not the sleep of avoidance, but the sleep of having thought carefully about something difficult and left it sitting, with the confidence that careful thought is itself worthwhile, even when it does not resolve into an answer. The wasteland is still out there. The signal is still broadcasting. The music is still playing. Good night. The stars above the wasteland do not know what happened below them. They have been watching for longer than any civilization lasted, and they will be watching long after whatever comes next reaches its own conclusion. From up there, the 2 hours that ended the world are not distinguishable from the 2 centuries that followed. It is all one long moment, in the light that travels far enough. But we are not up there. We are here, in the dark, with the music playing and the radio still broadcasting and the questions still open and the vault door still cracked just wide enough to let in a little light. Close your eyes. The wasteland will be there when you wake up.